Elena had exactly $47 in her bank account, and a decision that would change her life forever, sitting on the table in front of her. She stared at the paper. It was thick, the kind of paper that felt expensive between the fingers, the kind that belonged in offices where people made decisions worth millions. She was not the kind of person who sat in those offices. She was a nurse who worked double shifts, wore shoes with holes in the soles, and ate lunch standing up in a break room that smelled of old coffee. But tonight, she was sitting in the 42nd floor office of Dominic Ashcroft, the man people in this city spoke about only in careful, quiet voices, and she was reading the most unusual document she had ever seen in her 26 years of life. A marriage contract. Her name was already printed on it, Elena Grace Hartley. Someone had done their research before she even walked through the door. She looked up from the paper. Dominic was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, looking out over the city lights below. He was tall, with the kind of build that suggested physical strength had never been something he needed to think about. His suit was dark, perfectly fitted, and his dark hair was cut short. He had not looked at her since his lawyer placed the document on the desk and left the room without a word. The office itself was the kind of room that made a person feel the smallness of ordinary life. The desk alone was larger than her kitchen. There were no family photographs anywhere, no personalized items, no evidence of warmth. There was only order, the precision of a man who had arranged his environment to communicate something specific. Power, certainly. Also, she thought, a particular kind of loneliness, though she suspected he would have strongly disagreed with that interpretation. Elena cleared her throat. Mr. Ashcroft. He turned then. His eyes were a deep, steady gray, and they settled on her with the same calm efficiency with which a surgeon might examine a problem. Not cold, exactly, but not warm either. Controlled. The eyes of a man who had long ago decided that whatever he felt, no one else would have easy access to it. You have read it, he said. It was not a question. I have read some of it, she said carefully. I want to understand what you are asking me. He walked from the window to the chair on the other side of the desk and sat down. He did not lean forward. He did not fold his hands in a friendly way. He simply sat and looked at her and waited. She noticed that he did not fidget. Most people fidgeted. They clicked pens or tapped fingers or cleared their throats unnecessarily. He was entirely still, and she found this both impressive and faintly unsettling. You need a wife, she said, on paper, for 12 months. Correct. And in exchange, you pay off my mother's medical debt. All of it. Every cent. Elena looked down at the number again. $287,000. It was printed there, in plain black ink, as though it were a small and unremarkable thing. For her mother, that number meant 3 years of hospital stays, 3 surgeries, 2 rounds of treatment that had not worked, and a 4th one that finally had. For Elena, it meant working 2 jobs, never sleeping, and still falling further behind every month. It meant skipping her own dental appointments and buying the reduced-price groceries at the end of the day, and telling herself, every morning when she put on her uniform, that she was managing. She was not managing. She had not been managing for a year and a half. Why me? She asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A slight tightening around the eyes. You were recommended. By who? Your former supervisor at Hartley Community Hospital, Dr. Owen Cole. Elena blinked. Owen Cole had been her mentor for 4 years. He was the most careful, most principled man she had ever known. He was the person who had taught her that medicine was not just about the body, but about the whole person sitting in front of you. The idea that he had recommended her for something like this made no sense at all. He told you about my mother's situation? He told me you were reliable, discreet, and capable of handling difficult circumstances without falling apart, Dominic said. I asked for those qualities specifically. He said you had them. The rest of your personal situation I found out through other means. She should have been angry about that. She was, a little. The idea that someone had looked into her life was the kind of thing that should have made her get up and leave, but the number on the paper kept pulling her attention back. What would this marriage involve exactly? She asked. Public appearances, events, the occasional business dinner where you would be expected to play the role of my wife convincingly. You will live in my home during the duration of the arrangement. You will be provided with everything you need, clothing, transport, personal expenses. There will be a household account for additional costs. At the end of 12 months, if both parties have fulfilled their obligations, you will receive a private settlement in addition to the debt payment. The amount is on page 3. She turned to page 3. She read the number. She put the paper back down very carefully, because her hands had started to shake slightly, and she did not want him to see that. The settlement was not a small thing. It was the kind of number that could buy her an entirely different life. She had not breathed properly in a very long time. "What are your obligations?" she asked. "Not mine. Yours." He looked at her for a moment, in a way that suggested the question had surprised him, though his face barely moved. "I will pay what I have promised, when I have promised it. I will not make unreasonable demands on your time outside of scheduled events. I will not interfere with your personal life as long as your personal life does not interfere with the appearance we are maintaining, and I will not cross any line that the contract does not specifically address." Elena understood what he meant. The contract was a business arrangement, nothing more. "And if I want to leave before the 12 months are up, then you forfeit the settlement. The debt payment will have already been made, and that will not be reversed. But you will owe the company nothing, and you will not be prevented from going." She sat with that for a moment. It was, she thought, a surprisingly fair escape clause for a man who reportedly never gave anything away. "Why do you need a wife at all?" she asked. "Someone like you could find a real one." His jaw shifted slightly. "Someone like me finds it very difficult to find a real one, who has no interest in my money, my name, or my business affairs. A contract removes the ambiguity. Both parties know exactly what this is. There is no confusion about feelings, no expectations that shift over time, no disappointment at the end." There was something in that answer that was more honest than she expected. It was the answer of a man who had clearly been disappointed before, or had done the disappointing, or both. It did not make her comfortable, exactly, but it made her feel slightly less like she was being tricked. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a business card on the desk between them. It was a simple card, his name, his private number, nothing else. "You have until Friday." It was Tuesday. She had 3 days to decide whether to sell a year of her life. Elena drove home in her 12-year-old car, with the contract in a sealed envelope on the passenger seat. She drove carefully, because the front left tire was starting to wear thin, and she had not had the money to replace it. The city moved past her windows in streaks of yellow and white light. The radio was on, a late-night program, quiet music between long advertisements, and she did not hear any of it. Her mind was on the number, always the number. Her mother was awake when she got home. She heard the television through the bedroom door, the low murmur of a documentary about migratory birds that her mother had been watching on repeat since she came home from the hospital 3 weeks ago. Elena knocked softly and opened the door. Margaret Hartley was 61 years old, and she looked, at that moment, 10 years older. She was thin in the way that long illness makes a person thin, not just in body, but in spirit. There was a translucence to her that had not been there before the first diagnosis 3 years ago. But her eyes, when she turned to look at Elena, were still sharp, still warm, still entirely her mother's eyes. "You are late," Margaret said. "I had a meeting." "At this hour? Sit down. You look pale." Elena sat on the edge of the bed and tried to decide what to say. She had thought, on the drive home, that she might tell her mother everything. But looking at her now, in the soft yellow light of the bedside lamp, she could not do it. Her mother would tell her not to. Her mother would say that no amount of money was worth selling a year of her life to a man she did not know, and her mother would be right, in the way that people who have never had $287,000 hanging over them can afford to be right. The principle was sound. The principle, however, did not pay the hospital. "Just tired," Elena said. "How are you feeling?" "Better than yesterday. Worse than I would like." Margaret reached out and touched Elena's hand. Her touch was gentle. It had always been gentle. "You work too hard." "Someone has to." "Elena." Her mother's voice was quiet. "I know what the bills look like. I am not completely in the dark. I am not asking you to fix it. I am asking you to stop carrying it alone, like it is something you did wrong." Elena looked at her mother's hand on hers. The skin was soft and loose in the way that it gets after many years, and Elena remembered, with a clarity that hurt, what those hands had looked like when she was small, strong and certain, capable of fixing anything. She stayed until her mother fell asleep. Then she went to the kitchen and sat at the table without turning on a light. She just sat and thought and tried to find the version of this decision she could live with. By Thursday morning, she had called in a favor and had the contract reviewed by a paralegal she had gone to school with. The paralegal, a practical woman named Carol who wore reading glasses on a string around her neck and did not believe in softening difficult information, read the contract twice and then said, with a kind of calm respect, that it was one of the most airtight personal agreements she had ever seen. Every protection Elena could want was written into it. There were clauses about privacy, about living conditions, about the right to leave. There were detailed provisions about what constituted a violation and what the consequences would be. There were penalties built in on his side if he broke any of the terms. "Does it protect me?" Elena asked. "As much as any document can protect a person in a situation like this," Carol said. "Yes." That evening, Elena called the private number. He answered on the second ring. Hartley. She had not expected him to know it was her. She had not thought to block her number. It was a small thing, but it made her feel, briefly, as though he had been waiting. "I will do it," she said. Silence. Not a long one. A brief, complete pause. Friday morning. 9 o'clock. Bring identification. "That is it?" "No. No explanation, or—" "The contract will be ready for signature," he said. "Dress professionally." And then he hung up. Elena looked at her phone for a moment. Then she put it down and went to her mother's room. She told her that she had taken a new position, that it required her to relocate temporarily, that the arrangement was well paid and the situation was safe, that everything was going to be fine. Her mother looked at her for a long moment with those sharp, warm eyes. "You are not telling me everything," she said. "I never do," Elena said, and she smiled, and her mother, after a moment, smiled back. Friday arrived the way that important days often do. Cold, plain, slightly too bright, as though the world was paying a particular kind of attention. Elena wore her best blouse and the only blazer she owned that did not have a loose button. She arrived at the Ashcroft building at 8:55 and was met at the lobby by a man named Gerard, who had a quiet, efficient manner and who moved through the building as though he had been born in it. The contract signing happened in a conference room with 8 people present, none of whom introduced themselves. Dominic sat across from her at the long table. He was, again, perfectly composed. He signed his name with the same ease with which most people sign a grocery receipt. Elena's hand paused over the line for a moment. She thought of the number. She thought of her mother's thin hands and the tea that went cold. She thought of the 3-year hospital file that lived in a folder in her kitchen drawer. She signed. The room emptied quickly. Gerard returned to tell her that a car would collect her Sunday morning to take her to the estate. She was to bring only personal items. Everything else would be provided. She nodded. She thanked him. She walked back through the lobby and out through the revolving door into the cold morning air. She stood on the pavement for a moment, the city moving around her the way it always did, indifferent and enormous, and completely unaware that anything significant had just occurred. She had just agreed to be the wife of a man she did not know, in a house she had never seen, for a year of her life. She had done it with her eyes open and her hands steady, and her reasons clear in her mind. She had done it for her mother. She had done it because there was no other way out of a situation that had been closing in on her for 3 years. She told herself that it was the only logical choice. She told herself that 12 months was not so long. She told herself these things very firmly, and then she went to buy a coffee from the cart on the corner, because she had not eaten since the night before, and her hands were still, very slightly, shaking. She had been standing outside the Ashcroft building for longer than she realized. The coffee from the cart was finished. The cup was still in her hand. Someone walked past and gave her the brief sideways glance that city people give each other when they need to assess whether a stopped person is a problem or simply a person who has stopped. She was not a problem. She was a woman who had just made the most significant decision of her adult life and was standing still while her body caught up to her mind. She walked to the corner and put the cup in a bin. She pulled her coat tighter. The wind off the river was sharper than it had been when she went in, which meant the morning had moved on without her while she was on the 42nd floor, and the city had gotten on with itself, entirely without noticing that anything significant had happened. That was useful, she thought. That was the thing about cities. They did not notice. They had their own enormous ongoing business, and a single woman on a pavement was not part of it, and that anonymity was, in this moment, a gift. She walked to the car park. She sat in her car for a moment, before starting the engine. She put both hands on the steering wheel, and looked at the wall of the car park in front of her, and thought, methodically, about what she had agreed to, and what it meant, and what she was going to do next. What she had agreed to: 12 months, a house she had never seen, a man she had spent 45 minutes with, a contract that Carol had called airtight. What it meant: her mother's debt, cleared, her mother's future, less precarious. The particular weight that Elena had been carrying, the weight of a problem too large for honest effort alone, would be gone. Not solved by her own hand, but gone. She had mixed feelings about that. She had always preferred to solve things herself, but she was a practical person, and practically speaking, the weight would be gone, and that was what mattered. What she was going to do next: she was going to drive home. She was going to tell her mother something true but incomplete. She was going to spend 2 days being as ordinary as possible, and then on Sunday, she was going to face forward and go. She started the engine. On the drive home, she thought about Dr. Owen Cole. She had not yet decided how she felt about him recommending her for this. On one level, it was a profound act of trust. He had believed she could handle it, had believed in her reliability and discretion and capability. On another level, it was a significant presumption about what she would be willing to do, and he had made that presumption without asking her first. She had not asked him about it before accepting. She had not had time, but she thought she would, eventually. She thought she would sit across from him in the consulting room, where he had taught her most of what she knew about medicine and about people, and she would ask him why he had thought of her specifically, and she would listen to his answer, and she would decide then how she felt. For now, she drove. The city fell away on either side of her. The radio played something low and instrumental. The familiar streets moved past her windows, and she drove through them the way she had driven through them 1,000 times, noticing nothing in particular, her mind somewhere else entirely. She thought about what a year looked like. She had spent years thinking in terms of shifts: 12 hours, 24 hours, a week of shifts, a month of shifts. Longer than that had always felt abstract, too large to hold, too uncertain to plan for. A year was 12 months of shifts, which she had done before. A year was 4 seasons, which she had seen before. A year was 365 mornings, and she had gotten through every morning she had ever had so far. She could get through these ones too. She pulled into the space outside her building. She sat for a moment longer, the engine off now, the city quiet around the car. She thought about what her mother had said: "I am not asking you to fix it. I am asking you to stop carrying it alone." She was not stopping carrying it. She was finding a different way to carry it. That was not the same thing. But it was, she thought, the closest she could manage, and the closest she could manage would have to be enough. She got out of the car. She went upstairs. She made dinner for 2. What she could not have known, standing there on that pavement with her coffee going cold and the city rushing past her, was that the decision she had just made was not the beginning of a transaction. It was the beginning of something far more complicated. Something she had no contract to protect her from. She used her remaining 2 days well. She cleaned her apartment, though no one would be using it. She cooked her mother's favorite soup and sat with her both evenings. She called Carol to say thank you. She went to her regular Saturday morning shift at the clinic, and she helped 4 people, and she felt, for those hours, entirely like herself. Sunday morning came quietly. The car arrived at 7:30, a dark, silent vehicle, with a driver who nodded and held the door. Elena put her 2 bags in the boot. She had packed light: clothes, books, a photograph of her mother, the small carved wooden bird her father had given her when she was 9. She had not packed as though she were going on a great adventure. She had packed as though she were going somewhere for work, which was, she reminded herself, exactly what this was. She looked back at her building as the car pulled away. The morning was gray and still. A pigeon sat on the 3rd-floor windowsill of what used to be her bathroom window, unbothered and unaware that anything was changing. Elena faced forward. The drive took 40 minutes. When the gate opened and the car moved up a long private driveway lined with old oak trees, she sat very still and looked ahead and reminded herself, one final time, that she was a woman who handled difficult circumstances without falling apart. Dr. Owen Cole had told Dominic Ashcroft that. She intended to prove him right. She intended to prove herself right, which was harder. The estate was not what she had imagined, and she had tried, on the drive, to imagine it accurately. She had expected something cold and imposing, all glass and sharp angles, the kind of building that was designed to make people feel small the moment they stood in front of it. She had seen photographs of properties like that in magazines, vast, gray, geometric, surrounded by manicured lawns that looked as though they had been measured with rulers. What she found instead was a house, a very large one, certainly, with stone walls that had the slightly uneven quality of something built in another century, and tall windows that caught the morning light unevenly, brighter in some panes than others, because the glass was old and slightly warped. There was a west wing that stretched further than she could see from the front drive, and a series of outbuildings tucked behind a low stone wall. But it was surrounded by actual trees, not ornamental ones, but old, mature, opinionated trees that had been there long before the house and would be there long after, trees that grew where they had decided to grow and did not ask permission. The lawns were good but not perfect, with the imprecision of something maintained by people who cared about the garden rather than its appearance. On the east side, she could see the beginning of a garden. Even in early March, with nothing much growing yet, it had the organized shape of something tended with real intention. It looked, she thought with some surprise, like a place where someone actually lived. Gerard was waiting at the front entrance. He led her inside without a great deal of ceremony, which she was grateful for. She had been dreading some kind of formal greeting, the performance of arrival, the expectation that she would react to things appropriately. But Gerard simply held the door and said that he hoped the drive had been comfortable and that he would show her to her rooms. The interior was clean and quiet. The floors were pale stone, cool and smooth underfoot. The ceilings were high, not absurdly so, but enough to give each room a particular kind of air. The furniture was good, but not showy, chosen for something closer to comfort than performance. There were books in the hallways, she noticed immediately. Not decorative books arranged by color, but actual books, some with bookmarks in them, some lying flat because they had lost their spines, all with the particular look of things that had been read and put down and picked up again. She was taken to her rooms in the north wing. They were, by any reasonable measure, the most beautiful rooms she had ever been asked to occupy. A bedroom with a tall window that looked out over the east garden, so that the first thing you would see in the morning was the organized shapes of the garden and, beyond it, the oak trees. A sitting room with bookshelves that went from floor to ceiling, and a wide, low chair positioned near the window, in a way that made it clear someone had thought about where the light would be best for reading. A private bathroom where everything matched, which was something she had not experienced since her family had money, which was a very long time ago. There was a wardrobe full of clothes that she had not asked for and did not entirely know how to feel about. They were all in her size. She took that in for a moment, understanding what it meant, which was that someone had found out her measurements along with everything else about her. But they were in the kind of restrained, quiet fabrics that she herself might have chosen if she had ever had the money. Good quality, nothing elaborate, in colors that would work together. Someone had given the matter real thought. She stood in front of the open wardrobe for a moment and thought, this is what it costs him to acquire the kind of help he needs. It is, for him, a reasonable expense. She told herself to treat it the same way. Gerard handed her a schedule for the week. It was more structured than she expected. There was a dinner on Wednesday, a small gathering of Dominic's business associates and their partners. There was a public appearance on Saturday, a charity event, formal dress required. The rest of the week was largely open, though she was asked to keep her phone available and to inform the household if she planned to leave the estate. She asked if there was anything she should know before she met Dominic. Gerard paused, in a way that was professionally neutral, but contained, she thought, quite a lot of information. It was the pause of someone who had a great deal to say and had decided, for entirely sensible reasons, to say almost none of it. Mr. Ashcroft will meet you for dinner at 7 this evening, he said. He prefers punctuality. She arrived at 7 exactly. Not a minute early, which would have looked eager. Not a minute late, which would have looked careless. The dining room was a large, well-lit space with a long table that could have seated 20. The table had been set at one end, with 2 places facing each other at a reasonable distance, not so close as to be intimate, not so far as to require raised voices. It was a small mercy that she noted carefully. Someone had thought about it. Dominic was already there. He was not in a suit tonight. He wore a dark shirt with the collar open, and he was standing by the window with a glass of water, looking at something outside in the early dark. When she entered, he turned and looked at her, the way he always seemed to, directly, without the slight performance of surprise or greeting that most people use as social glue. He simply looked at her, acknowledged her presence, and waited for something useful to begin. "You are on time," he said. "You said 7. They sat. A member of staff came in briefly with the first course, set it down without speaking, and then was gone. Elena looked at the food and realized she was genuinely hungry, which was a relief, because it gave her something practical to focus on while she assembled her understanding of this room, and this man, and this new arrangement she had entered into. "The Wednesday dinner," she said, when the silence had gone on long enough that she could feel it becoming pointed on his end. "Who will be there?" 6 guests. 3 couples, primarily business connections. You will be introduced as my wife. You will not need to know the details of my work. Questions about your own background are fine to answer naturally and honestly, with the exception of how we met. The official version of our meeting is in the green folder in your sitting room. I suggest reading it tonight. She had not yet opened the green folder. She made a mental note to do so the moment she returned upstairs. "What do they know?" she asked. "Do any of them know this is an arrangement?" "No." "Have you been married before?" "No." "Engaged?" He looked at her briefly, in the way that a person looks at someone who has asked a question they consider obvious. "No." "So people will be surprised. Some of them, others will have seen the announcement and will have had time to process it." She absorbed that, the announcement, she thought, not a celebration, not an excited phone call to family, an announcement, dispatched on a Thursday, processed by the people who received it, filed away and prepared for like a business memo. "And does it matter to you?" "What they think." He took a slow drink of water and set the glass down. "It matters to the appearance we are maintaining, which is what you are here for." She nodded. It was a fair answer. It was the correct answer. She told herself to stop expecting anything else. "I would like to know the practical rules," she said. "Not the ones in the contract, the operational ones. If I want to go out during the day, is there a process? If I want to continue some of my work, I was volunteering at a clinic on Saturday mornings before I came here. Can I continue that?" Something shifted. She had learned, in her years of nursing, to read the small physical adjustments people made when they were registering something unexpected. This was one of those. It was nearly invisible, but she caught it. "The volunteer work," he said. "Where is the clinic?" "St. Augustine's Community Clinic, about 40 minutes south of here." He was quiet for a moment. "I will arrange a driver." She blinked. "I have my own car." "Your car needs a new front tire," he said, "and the left rear brake light is out." Elena put her fork down very carefully. "You had my car checked." "I had it checked when you signed the contract," he said, in a tone that suggested this was entirely obvious. "You will be traveling on private roads and public roads connected to this property. Safety matters." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not looking at her. He was cutting something on his plate, with the focused attention of a man who had said what he needed to say, and considered the matter settled. "Thank you," she said finally, because there was no useful argument to be had, and because, fundamentally, he was right. "The car will be fixed by Monday," he said. She picked up her fork. "I will still need to know the protocol," she said. "If I am going somewhere during the day, who do I inform?" "Gerard." "Just Gerard?" "Just Gerard." They ate in silence for a while after that. It was not, she realized as the minutes passed, an uncomfortable silence. It was simply quiet, the kind of quiet that settles between two people who are not performing for each other and have nothing false to fill the air with. She did not know exactly what to do with that, so she let it be, and ate her food, and looked at the candle flame, and thought about what she was doing here, and whether she had made the right choice. At the end of dinner, when she stood to leave, he spoke again. "The green folder also has emergency contact information," he said, still looking at the table rather than at her. "My private number is on the first page. If anything happens, anything that requires immediate attention, you call that number directly. Not Gerard, me." She stopped in the doorway. Why not Gerard? He seems entirely capable. He was quiet for a moment. Because Gerard is efficient, he said. But I am the one who is responsible. She thought about that on the walk back to her rooms. She turned it over in her mind, the way she turned difficult things over. Quietly, methodically, without hurrying toward a conclusion. She did not come to a conclusion that night. She opened the green folder instead, and read the official account of their first meeting. A fundraising event 16 months ago. A mutual acquaintance who had introduced them. An early connection that had developed over several months of private correspondence. The story was detailed enough to be convincing, with specific dates and locations, and a plausible emotional trajectory. It was also vague enough in the right places, the places where vagueness was more convincing than specificity. Someone had thought about it very carefully. She read it twice. Then she went to sleep in the largest bed she had ever occupied. She slept well, which genuinely surprised her. In the days that followed, she found the shape of life at the estate by small degrees. The house was large enough that she could spend half a day without seeing Dominic at all, which turned out to be a relief she had not known she needed. Having her own space within the arrangement, the sitting room, the morning library she discovered on her second day, the garden path along the east wall that no one else seemed to use in the mornings, made it feel less like a performance and more like a life. The staff were professional and warm, in a way that was not distant. Della, who ran the kitchen, and who had clearly been at the estate for a very long time, had the particular manner of someone who had formed strong opinions about the people she worked for, and was not shy about letting those opinions shape how she behaved. She appeared, occasionally and without explanation, with tea or a plate of something, just when Elena was beginning to feel the quiet of the house, which meant that she was paying close attention to the rhythms of the rooms. Gerard kept her schedule organized, and her transitions smooth. She began to understand that his great skill was invisibility, not because he was absent, but because he arranged things in advance of anyone needing to ask for them. She walked in the garden every morning. She read, which she had not done properly in months, because she had always been too tired. She called her mother every evening. She did not tell her mother about the size of the wardrobe, or the quality of the bed, or the fact that she had stood in the morning library that first week, and felt, very unexpectedly, something approaching peace. She talked about the garden, because her mother had always loved gardens. She said the house was old, and the ceilings were high, and there was a bird in the oak tree near her window that she was fairly certain was a thrush.
Are you happy?
Her mother asked, on the fourth evening. I am well, Elena said. I am safe. The work is manageable. That is not what I asked. Elena looked at the window. Outside, the sky was going dark behind the oak tree. I am all right, she said. I promise. She used her first full week to understand the geography of the house in the way she had always understood new environments, by walking the same paths repeatedly at different hours, noticing how the light changed, noticing which rooms felt different in the morning versus the evening, noticing which spaces were genuinely used and which were maintained but not occupied. The house was used. That was the first clear thing. It was not a showpiece. The kitchen was a working kitchen. The pans had the particular patina of things that had been used regularly and cared for, not replaced frequently. The study was a working study, full of papers and books and the evidence of ongoing thought. The library off the east corridor, which she discovered on her second morning, had the relaxed disorder of shelves that were added to regularly rather than curated for appearance. It was a house that had been lived in for a long time. Dominic had bought it 8 years ago, she had read in the green folder, which contained a brief history of the property as part of the background material he had prepared. 8 years was long enough to make a house your own, if you were the kind of person who settled into places. She was not sure yet whether he was that kind of person. His office had suggested otherwise. This house suggested something different. She found the discrepancy interesting. She also found interesting the way the household operated around Dominic without appearing to operate around him. Gerard was invisible until needed. Della was present in the way that warmth is present in a room with a good fire, noticeable not as a specific source but as a quality of the air. The other members of the staff moved through the house with the particular efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were doing and had been doing it long enough that they no longer needed to think about it. It was, she thought, on her fourth morning, while eating breakfast in the kitchen, because Della had appeared with it before she had decided where to eat, and the kitchen table was right there. It was a household that had found its rhythm. That rhythm did not yet include her, precisely. She was adjacent to it. She moved through the same spaces, and used the same kitchen, and ate at the same table, but the household's rhythm had been established around a different configuration, and she could feel the slight adjustment it was making to account for her presence. She thought this was something to pay attention to. She thought she should not insert herself into the existing rhythm too quickly, or try to change it. She should simply be present, and let the adjustment happen organically, and over time the rhythm would include her in a way that felt natural, rather than imposed. This was, she recognized, exactly the approach she took with new patients, with families who had been in their own configuration for a long time and were now having to accommodate a new presence, a nurse, a care team, a changed set of needs. You did not arrive and immediately rearrange things. You arrived and you were careful, and you let the people who knew the space teach you what they knew, and then gradually, by being reliably present and reliable in your character, you became part of the space. She was applying nursing principles to her own domestic situation, which was, she thought, either very practical or slightly absurd. Probably both. On Saturday morning she went to the clinic for the first time since arriving at the estate, and the driver Dominic had arranged was a quiet, efficient man named Neil who waited in the car while she worked, and did not appear to have any particular feelings about the hours he was waiting. She spent 4 hours at the clinic, and helped 6 people, and felt, for those hours, exactly like herself. Not Elena Ashcroft, wife of, not Elena Grace Hartley, signatory to a contract, just Elena, who was a nurse, who was good at it, who found in the work itself a kind of steadying that no other part of her life quite provided. She came back to the estate in the early afternoon with the specific tiredness of someone who has been thoroughly useful, which was a different and better kind of tired than the one she usually carried. She was walking through the east corridor toward the library when she nearly walked into Dominic, who was coming the other way, with a folder of papers in his hand, and his jacket off, and his sleeves rolled up in the manner of someone deep in the middle of something. He stopped when he saw her. "The clinic," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said. "Good morning there. How is yours?" He looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes looked at her, as though she had said something that required a slight recalibration of some internal model. "Fine," he said, "productive." "Good." She moved to go past him. "Elena." She paused. "Neil's assessment of the route is that Saturdays the South Road adds 40 minutes. There is a better route. I will have him use it next week." She looked at him. He was already looking back at the folder. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, briefly, and went on his way. She went on hers, and she stood in the library for a moment, before choosing a book, and she thought about a man who had learned the Saturday traffic patterns on the South Road, so that his contractual wife could get to her volunteer shift more efficiently. She thought, that is either very practical or very something else. She chose her book and sat in the chair by the window, and decided she was not going to examine it any further today. Wednesday evening arrived, and Elena put on one of the dresses from the wardrobe, a deep navy one, long and simple, which fit her, as though it had been made with her body specifically in mind. She went downstairs to stand beside a man who was, on paper, her husband. Dominic looked at her when she came down the main staircase. Just for a moment, a brief, careful look, the kind that took in the total picture efficiently, and then moved on. Then he turned to greet the arriving guests, and his hand came to rest at the small of her back, very lightly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She did not step away. She held her head up and smiled, and said the right things to the right people, and she asked questions that made them feel listened to, and she noticed things, the way the Calloway woman kept glancing at Dominic with a kind of proprietary curiosity, the way one of the guests had a question forming behind his eyes every time the conversation moved toward the topic of the upcoming board vote. She noticed all of these things because that was what she did. After the guests left, when the house was quiet again, she went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. Dominic was already there. He was standing at the counter with his jacket removed and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking at something on his phone. He looked up when she came in, and there was a moment, just a moment, where neither of them said anything. "You did well tonight," he said. She filled her glass. It was not difficult. Your guests are genuinely interesting people. Most of them, he said. He put his phone down. The Calloway woman asked where we went on our honeymoon. I know. I told her we kept it private. Small. Just the two of us somewhere without signals. She looked at him. She seemed satisfied. People generally are when you give them an answer that sounds like it has feelings in it, even if the feelings are unspecified. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Something that existed in the same neighborhood as one. Get some rest, he said. There is an early call Saturday. She nodded. She took her water and walked to the door. Then she stopped. The photograph, she said, without turning around. On your desk in the study. The boy, in the frame. She felt the quality of the silence change behind her. I was not snooping, she said quickly. I walked past the study, and the door was open, and I saw it from the corridor. I am sorry. It was not my place to notice it. She left before he could answer. That night, lying in the large, quiet bed, she thought about the way the silence had changed when she mentioned the photograph. She thought about how a man who was supposed to be entirely unreachable had said, in a kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, that she had done well. She fell asleep, wondering what the photograph meant, and why she could not stop thinking about it, and reminding herself very firmly that she was here for 12 months, and not a single day longer. She had been at the estate for 3 weeks, when Senator Callum Drake appeared at the Thursday evening dinner, and nothing was the same after that. She had not been warned. The dinner had been on the schedule as a small gathering of business partners, and she had prepared for it in the way she now prepared for all such events, reading the relevant profiles Gerard left in the green folder, selecting from the wardrobe something appropriate to the occasion, arriving 2 minutes early, because Dominic had once said, without looking up from his paperwork, that arriving early was the only honest kind of punctuality. The senator was not in the green folder. He arrived with a separate group, and was introduced to her in the period before dinner, when the guests were gathering near the fireplace in the main sitting room. One of the other guests made the introduction, a man named Frederick something, who was pleased to know both of them and thought they ought to know each other, and Drake took her hand with the easy confidence of a man who had spent decades in rooms where first impressions were currency. He was tall, well-built, with silver at his temples that he wore with careful casualness. His suit was expensive. His smile arrived before his words and stayed after them, which was a quality she did not trust in anyone. Elena Ashcroft, he said, tasting the name, turning it over in his mouth like a wine he was trying to identify. I have been hearing that Dominic's wife was something of a mystery. We value our privacy, she said, pleasantly, the way she had learned to say things that were actually something else, a firm boundary, wearing the expression of a polite observation. Of course. His smile widened without becoming warmer. Though I find it interesting, the things that are private and the things that are not. I have been in this city a long time, Mrs. Ashcroft. I know a great many people, and yet, before the announcement, I heard nothing at all about you. Many people live quiet lives, she said. They do. He held her gaze with the steady confidence of someone who is accustomed to making other people look away first. Though a quiet life is not typically what one associates with a relationship with Dominic Ashcroft. She said nothing. She had learned, through years of working in a hospital, that silence was one of the most powerful tools available, and that knowing when to use it was half of what made any conversation manageable. She stood in the silence calmly, and she did not blink more than was natural, and she did not look away. Drake lowered his voice slightly, not to a whisper. He was too clever for that. Too aware that whispers draw attention, just to the quiet register of two people having a frank conversation at the edge of a social gathering. I wonder, he said, how long you intend to keep this up. Her pulse did not jump. This also was training, the ability to keep the physical response of surprise or alarm from reaching the face, from reaching the hands, from reaching anything visible. I am not sure I know what you mean, she said. I think you know exactly what I mean, he said. Easily, not unkindly. This arrangement of yours. It is very tidy, very well timed, very convenient for Dominic, particularly given the board's position on his personal situation and the upcoming acquisition vote. She held his gaze. Dominic and I have been together for some time, she said. The timing of our marriage is personal. He looked at her, with the particular expression of someone who has already decided what the truth is and is testing it against what he is hearing. I have known Dominic for 15 years. I know how he operates. He does not do anything casually. He does not announce a wife without a reason. And he does not do it quietly, unless the reason is something he would rather not have examined closely. Many couples prefer quiet announcements, she said. Some do. He paused. Tell me, where were you before this? I ask because I have looked, quite carefully, and you are surprisingly difficult to find in the usual places. She was a nurse who had worked double shifts at a community hospital and volunteered at a free clinic on Saturday mornings. She had no reason to appear in the usual places where senators' researchers looked, but she did not say any of this. She kept her expression easy, slightly puzzled, the way a person looks when they are being asked an odd question rather than a threatening one. I have always valued my privacy, she said. Dominic respects that. Drake opened his mouth to say something else. There was more coming. She could see it building. Dominic appeared at her side. She had not heard him coming. This was a thing she was learning about him. He moved through rooms with a particular quality of purposeful quiet. His hand came to the space at her side, not touching her, but present in a way that was felt. The geometry of it was unmistakable. Callum, he said. The word landed with the pleasantness of a door being closed very gently. A soft sound that was also, unmistakably, a close. Drake's smile shifted. It did not fall. He was far too experienced for it to fall, but it adjusted. Dominic, he extended his hand easily. We were just getting acquainted. I can see that. Dominic shook the hand briefly, released it. He looked at Drake for a moment with his steady, gray, entirely unhurried look. Then, Elena, there is someone I would like you to meet. She moved with him, without any hesitation at all. She turned from Drake with the ease of someone who was completely finished with a conversation and had somewhere better to be. They moved across the room, and she deployed everything she had: warmth, questions, genuine listening, the particular skill of making two people feel they were the most interesting people in any room she had ever been in. All the while, she was aware of Drake somewhere behind her, still watching. When the evening ended and the guests had gone, Dominic walked with her to the foot of the main staircase. The hallway was still, the stone floors cool. Drake spoke to you, he said. Yes. Before I arrived. What did he say? She told him. All of it, exactly as it had happened, in the order it had happened, without interpretation or commentary. Dominic listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What did you say to him? As little as possible. A brief pause. Good. He looked at her. Drake has been a professional antagonist for 15 years. He is careful, experienced, and he does not make direct accusations without evidence. What he does instead is create uncertainty. He plants questions, and then watches what grows. I know, she said. That is what he was doing. He looked at her steadily. He is going to probe further. What you saw tonight was an introduction. What is he looking for specifically? She asked. What does he gain if he finds what he is looking for? The board vote, Dominic said. It is in 6 weeks. There are 3 members of the board who have been uncertain about the acquisition, not because they oppose it on its merits, but because they are uncertain about me. There is a faction that believes my personal situation represents instability. Drake is that faction's most useful voice. If he can raise sufficient doubt about this marriage, he weakens my position going into the vote. So the marriage is part of the argument being made to the board, that you are stable, a person whose judgment can be trusted. Yes. And Drake knows this. Drake knows everything that can be known about the political situation. He is very good at his work. A pause. He is less good at being a decent human being, but that has rarely been a professional requirement. She almost laughed. It was the first thing he had said in her presence that was clearly meant to be something other than purely informational, and it landed with the unexpectedness of a window opening in a room she had thought was sealed. What do we do? She asked. We continue, he said. We give him nothing. We are visible, we are consistent, we are entirely unremarkable. The story we are telling does not need to be shouted, it only needs to be steady. She nodded. There will be a statement, he said, from his direction, or from someone connected to him. It is the natural next step after a probe like tonight. I want you to be prepared for it. She stood with that for a moment. And the clinic, she said. Saturday. Is it still? Gerard will have a driver ready, he said. Continue your routine. Disruption would look strange. She had not expected him to think about that. She had thought she might need to argue for it. Thank you, she said. The following morning, Gerard appeared in the garden with a revised folder. Drake's full dossier had been added. His political history, his professional associations, his funding sources, the names of the board members he was closest to, the pattern of his past maneuvers in similar situations. At the end of the dossier, in Dominic's handwriting, she had learned to recognize it by now. That precise, slightly narrow script was a single brief note. Do not engage directly if avoidable. If unavoidable, remain entirely ordinary. She read the dossier twice. She made a few notes of her own in the margins, the way she had always done with difficult material. She noted the pattern of Drake's approaches, which was consistent across several situations. He never went directly for the thing he wanted. He went for the edges of it. He created a perimeter of doubt, and then contracted it slowly, until there was nowhere comfortable left to stand. She was not going to give him edges to approach. 2 days after the dinner, the story appeared. She was between patients at the clinic when her phone lit up with a message from Gerard. A news outlet had published a story. The headline described her as a woman of uncertain background who had appeared in Dominic Ashcroft's life 6 weeks before their sudden and unannounced marriage. The story was careful, in the way that damaging stories sometimes are, never saying outright what it was implying, but constructing the implication with great precision. In the week after the Drake dinner, Elena paid close attention to how the household absorbed what had happened and what it did with it. She noticed that Gerard's briefings became slightly more detailed, not alarmist, never alarmist, but more complete. She noticed that the social calendar, which had been relatively open for the coming weeks, acquired a small number of additional entries, a lunch here, a brief appearance there, a dinner that had not been on the original schedule. Each of these, she understood, was a deliberate act of visibility. Each of them required her to show up in a particular way, and each of them, she thought, also provided her with more practice, which meant that whatever Drake might throw at them next, she would be more prepared for it. She thought about preparation. She had always been a person who prepared. It was one of the things Owen Cole had told her, early in her training, that separated the nurses who were good from the nurses who were excellent. The excellent ones prepared not just for what was likely to happen, but for what might happen, the edge cases, the unexpected turns. You read the full file, not just the notes from the last visit. You asked the extra question even when time was short. You thought about what the patient had not said, as well as what they had. She was applying that quality of attention here, which felt, in the context of this arrangement, both appropriate and slightly strange. She was preparing for social situations the way she had prepared for clinical ones. She was reading the room, Drake's room, the board's room, the room of public perception, the way she read a patient, carefully, fully, without skipping the parts that were difficult or ambiguous. She thought this was probably useful. She also noticed, in this week, that Dominic's manner toward her had shifted in a way that was small but real. It was not warmer, exactly. Warm was not his register, but it was more direct. The information he shared with her about the Drake situation, the board members, the specific arguments, the documents he passed to her, was more complete than it might have been. More trusting, in the practical sense of trusting her with the full picture, rather than the version of the picture that required her to operate without context. She appreciated that. She had always worked better with the full picture. She brought this quality to the Saturday event, where she moved through the room with the particular kind of attention that made people feel seen without feeling observed, which was a skill she had been developing for years, in contexts that were considerably higher stakes than a charity fundraiser. She asked good questions. She listened to the answers. She connected people to each other when she could see they would benefit from the connection, and she did it in a way that felt natural, rather than engineered. Afterward, in the car, when Dominic said she was good at it, she did not deflect the observation. She received it, which was something she was also working on. She had a habit, she knew she had it, she had identified it years ago, of deflecting recognition, of redirecting credit toward the situation, or the other person, or the particular demands of the context, rather than accepting that she had simply been good at something. It was a habit formed in a professional environment, where claiming competence too directly could seem like arrogance, and it had served her there. In this context, she thought it was not serving her, because Dominic's observations were accurate observations, and deflecting them was a form of dishonesty that he, who prized accuracy, would notice. So she said, "I am good at reading people," and she let it sit. He looked at her then, briefly, in the way he sometimes looked at her. She looked back at him. And then the car was at the gate, and the moment passed, and she went inside and upstairs, and she stood in her room for a moment, before doing anything else, and she thought about how very specific the quality of his attention was, and how very unusual it was to be on the receiving end of that quality of attention from a person who gave it to very few things. She thought, "I should be more careful." She thought, "I am going to have a very difficult time being more careful." She changed out of her dress, and hung it up, and went to find her book, and she was careful, and she was not careful, and the evening was what it was. She finished her shift. She drove back to the estate in the repaired car, which now handled properly. She sat in her sitting room for 20 minutes, and thought about what she felt, which was something she believed was important to know clearly, before walking into a conversation that required composure. What she felt was calm. Not performance calm, not the calm that sits on top of something else. Actual calm. She had been through genuinely frightening things in her life. A story arranged by a man with a political agenda was difficult, but it was not in the category of frightening things. It was in the category of solvable things. She went downstairs. Dominic was in his study. The door was open. She came in without knocking. "I have seen it," she said. He was on the phone. He held up one finger, finished the call in 3 sentences, and put the phone down. "Come in," he said, which she already had. She sat in the chair across from his desk, and the photograph was there, always in the same place on the corner of the desk. The boy, perhaps 9 or 10, dark hair, a slightly too large smile, standing somewhere outdoors with trees behind him, looking at the camera as though it was a friend he was very pleased to see. She looked away from the photograph and back at Dominic. "What do we do?" she asked. "We respond," he said. "Not to the story directly, to the story's premise. The premise is that this marriage is not genuine. The response to that premise is not a statement. It is a life. We go on Saturday. We are there. We are entirely uninteresting." He handed her a new folder. "It will not silence Drake, but it will deprive the story of the oxygen it needs to grow." She took the folder and looked at the cover. "You had this prepared already," she said. He did not respond. "You had it prepared before the story came out," she said. "You prepared it when Drake arrived at dinner." Still nothing. But there was something in the set of his shoulders that was the equivalent, in his vocabulary, of a small confirmation. She sat with that for a moment. "You had it prepared, and you did not tell me to expect a story." "I did not know when the story would come," he said, "or in exactly what form. Telling you to expect a specific thing that might not arrive in that form seemed less useful than preparing you for the general situation, which is what the folder does." It was a reasonable answer. It was also, she thought, the answer of a man who was very accustomed to managing information as a tool. "Is there anything else you are managing," she said carefully, "that I should know about, so that I can help, rather than be surprised by?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. Which was not what she expected. He reached across the desk for a different folder, thinner, unmarked. Inside was a single page. A description of the board vote, its importance, the names of the 3 uncertain members, and the specific argument that Drake had been making to each of them over the past month. She read it. "He has been working on this for a month," she said. "At least. So our marriage was announced in response to something that had already begun. The timeline was compressed," he said. "The specific need became urgent 5 weeks ago, when I became aware of what Drake was doing." She nodded slowly. This was more of the picture than she had had before. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You asked directly," he said. "You deserved a direct answer." She stood to leave. At the door she paused. "I will be ready for Saturday," she said. "And I am going to be very, very ordinary." Something in the line of his shoulders eased, very slightly. Saturday came. She wore a deep green gown from the wardrobe, and she stood beside Dominic Ashcroft at a fundraising event for a children's hospital, and she moved through the room with the ease of someone who had done this many times and found it largely pleasant. She said the right things and listened with genuine interest to people who turned out to be interesting. And if anyone present was looking for doubt or discomfort or the small telltale signs of a person who did not belong, they found none of them. Drake was not there. She noticed his absence and understood its meaning. He had set something in motion, and he was watching it from a distance. He was not done. But he had also, in some specific way that she would understand more fully in the weeks to come, slightly miscalculated what he was dealing with. In the car going home, Dominic said, without preamble, "You are genuinely good at that." "I told you," she said, 10 years of managing frightened people, the skill transfers. "It does," he said, "more than most skills do." She nodded. They went through the gate. The oak trees closed over the drive. She thought, "We gave him nothing." She thought, "It is a start." It was Elena who found out about Marcus, and she did not find out because she was looking. She had been in the small library off the east corridor since 7:30. It had become, without formal declaration, her room. Not in any exclusive sense. The house was not hers and nothing in it was. But in the sense that everyone in the household now understood that she was in the library before 9, with her tea and her book, and the particular quality of morning light that came through the east window. She had learned the light of this house the way she had learned other things, methodically, attentively, in the way of someone who believes that understanding where you are is the first step to knowing how to be there well. She was deep in the 3rd chapter of a book about migratory navigation when she heard Dominic's voice through the partially open door at the far end of the corridor. He was not angry. He was not arguing. His voice was low and measured in the way that she had come to recognize as not neutral but controlled, which was different. Controlled meant something was being held in place by effort. She was going to get up and close the library door when she heard 2 things clearly, in rapid succession: the name of a medication she knew, and the phrase, "not responding." She stopped. She sat very still. The medication was one she had administered before, though not often. It was used for a specific and relatively rare neurological condition. The phrase, "not responding," had a precise technical meaning in this context. It meant that the second-line treatment was not producing the neurochemical changes it was expected to produce, which meant that the window of effective intervention was narrowing. She understood what that meant. She had sat in rooms where doctors said it to families. She had been the person in the room who handed tissues and answered questions after the doctor had gone. She stood up from her chair and crossed to the library door and closed it, gently and completely. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the wood of the door, and she made a decision. That evening she went to her room with her laptop and spent 4.5 hours doing what she did when she needed to know something well. She read. She read the 3 most recent papers from the research teams she knew were active on this condition. She read the updated criteria for the Edinburgh trial, which had opened to enrollment 6 weeks ago. She checked the participant profiles, the treatment approach, the preliminary outcomes from the cohort already enrolled, the lead researcher's publication record for the past 3 years. She did not feel that she was doing anything in particular. She was simply a nurse who had heard something and responded the way nurses respond, which is by finding out what the options are and making sure the right people know about them. She did not sleep very well that night. She lay in the dark and thought about the photograph on the desk, the boy with the too large smile and the jacket that did not fit, and she thought about 23, and about architecture, and about a life that was still, with a great deal of effort from the right people, capable of continuing. In the early morning, very early, before the house had properly begun its day, she went to the kitchen and made tea and sat with it. Then she went to the study. The door was unlocked. She had never been inside it before. She crossed to the desk and placed the single folded piece of paper in the center of it, exactly where he would not be able to miss it. She wrote his name at the top because it seemed right to acknowledge that this was meant for him. Then she wrote the name of the condition. Then the names of the 3 research teams, with the Edinburgh team at the top, with the note that they were the furthest along and had the least restrictive criteria. Then the full contact details for the Edinburgh lead researcher, and the URL for the trial registration, and a brief explanation of why this particular approach was different from the ones that had not been working. At the bottom she wrote, "I know this is not my place. I am sorry if this is not welcome, but I know this condition, and I know these names, and I could not keep them to myself." She walked back to the library. She picked up her book. She did not read it. He came at 8:45. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. She had learned to recognize them. She had not intended to learn them. But the house was quiet, and he was consistent, and after 5 weeks a person's footsteps become familiar, whether you mean them to or not. She heard the slight pause outside the library door before it opened. He was in the doorway, with the piece of paper in his hand. She set the book down and looked at him. She could not read his expression precisely, and she never entirely could. But she could read around the edges of what was not showing, the way you can read the shape of something in the dark by the absence of light around it. His posture was different. Something had been removed from it. Some particular held-in-place quality that was usually there. "How did you know?" he said. His voice was careful, not angry, not cold. The careful of someone who is asking a question that matters very much, and is trying to ask it in the way that is most likely to receive a true answer. "I heard you on the phone yesterday morning," she said. "I was crossing the room to close the door, and I heard the name of the medication, and the phrase, 'not responding.' I am sorry. I did not mean to." He was quiet. "Once I had heard it," she said, "I could not have just continued with my morning. I could not have sat there reading about migratory navigation and not thought about what those words meant and whether there was anything available. I am a nurse. It is not possible for me to know something relevant and not follow the thread." He looked down at the paper for a moment, then back at her. "The contact at the Edinburgh Institute," he said. "You know them personally?" "I attended a conference where the lead researcher presented the first cohort results. I heard the talk. I asked questions afterward. She is genuinely excellent. She has been working on this for 11 years, and the approach she is using is different from the standard pathway, in a way that addresses the specific mechanism that the standard approach does not reach." He walked to the chair across from her and sat down. She noticed that he sat the way he always sat, with the same precision, the same stillness, but that today, there was something underneath the precision that was less contained, as though the effort of maintaining the usual quality of steadiness was costing more than usual. "Marcus is my brother," he said. The words came out with a particular heaviness. Not grief. It was not that kind of weight. More the weight of a name that had been held very carefully for a very long time, put down now in front of someone he had not, until this moment, chosen to put it in front of. "I know," she said gently. "Gerard mentioned you had a brother, once, in passing. I put it together. He is 23. Dominic lowered the paper slightly. He was looking at something near the window, not at her. "He was diagnosed 14 months ago. The first treatment showed some early response, and then stopped working at month 4. The second-line treatment has now also been assessed as non-responsive." A pause. "We have 3 specialists. All 3 have been clear about what this means in terms of the narrowing window." "How narrow?" she asked, because she was a nurse, and nurses asked the questions that needed to be asked. The inquiry for the Edinburgh Institute took 2 full days to complete, and those 2 days were among the most concentrated and companionable she had spent at the estate so far. She had not expected companionable. She had expected professional, which was what the situation called for. She had expected that they would sit on opposite sides of the desk, and she would draft, and he would review, and they would exchange the material, in the way of 2 people working on a shared task efficiently, but without particular ease. It was efficient. It was also, and she registered this with some surprise, easy. He knew Marcus's case in exhaustive detail, the exact dates and sequences of the treatments, the specific language of each specialist's assessment, the numerical data from the various tests and scans. When she asked him questions, he answered them precisely and without having to refer to any notes, which meant he had memorized the entire medical history of his brother's condition, which was the kind of thing you did when you were afraid, and the only form of control available to you was information. She recognized it. She had done it herself, with her mother. She did not say so, but she noted it, with the precision she brought to noting things that were true about people. Her contribution was the translation, taking the medical facts he provided and rendering them in the language that clinical research institutions used, the particular register that was simultaneously precise and accessible, that conveyed both the seriousness of the case and the specific ways it aligned with the trial's existing parameters. She had written enough referral letters and case summaries in her career to know how to do this, and she was, she knew, good at it. He watched her write without interrupting. This was unusual in collaborative work, in her experience. Most people felt compelled to contribute continuously, to comment on the drafting as it happened, to redirect or suggest. He was content to provide information when asked, and to wait while she shaped it, which meant the drafting went quickly, and without the friction that usually attended collaborative writing. On the afternoon of the first day, they had the core of the inquiry. On the morning of the second day, they refined it. At noon on the second day, she read it back to him once from beginning to end, and he listened without speaking, and when she finished, he said, simply, "Send it." She sent it. The response from Edinburgh came 3 days later, which was significantly faster than she had expected. The lead researcher had read the inquiry, found it compelling, and was arranging a preliminary consultation. The timeline was expedited because the case presented a strong alignment with the trial's current phase, and because the inquiry, as the researcher put it in her response, was one of the clearest and most specifically targeted referrals she had received for this particular study. Elena read the response in her sitting room on a Tuesday morning, and she sat with it for a moment, and she felt something she recognized as relief. Pure, unqualified, physical relief. The kind that comes when something you were holding very carefully is taken from you by someone competent. She went to find Dominic. He was in the study. She knocked, which she did not always do, but this felt like news that deserved a door. He looked up. She told him. She read him the key sentences of the response, the ones about the timeline and the rationale and the expedited consultation. He listened. He looked at the surface of his desk. He was very still, which was not unusual, but this stillness was different. It was the stillness of someone who has just had something very large land in front of them and is trying to absorb it without losing their footing. After a moment he looked at her. His expression was one she did not yet have a precise name for. She would find the name for it later, over subsequent months, as it appeared in other circumstances. But that afternoon in the study she simply held it, and waited, and let him have the time he needed. Good, he said, finally, which was, she had come to understand, his version of a great deal more. Good, she agreed. She left him to his work. She went back to the library, and she sat in the chair, and she thought about Marcus, whom she had never met, who was 23, and had been dealing with this for 14 months, who collected stray animals, and had been about to ask someone to marry him when the world had changed. She thought, I hope Edinburgh is enough. She thought, I am going to do everything I can to make sure it is. He looked at her. They have said 6 months to a year before the options become significantly more limited. She nodded. Then the Edinburgh trial is the right direction, she said. The enrollment criteria would need to be assessed against his specific case, but from what you have described, the profile is a strong match. The trial opened 6 weeks ago. They are still in the early enrollment phase, which means there is still time. He held the paper. She could see him reading it, not for the first time, she thought. Why? He said. It was such a simple question that for a moment she did not know which part of it to answer. Because you are paying for my mother's treatment, she said. That is a large and real thing. I am not a person who can know something useful and not use it, when the reason I am sitting in this house at all is that someone was willing to help when I had run out of ways to help myself. She paused. And because no contract I have ever signed has told me to stop being who I am. He looked at her. He held her gaze for a long moment, and it was not the efficient, assessing quality of the look she had come to know as his primary mode. It was something different. She could not name it precisely. She filed it away. I will contact Edinburgh tomorrow, he said. Do you want me to draft the initial inquiry? I know the language the Institute uses in these applications. I know what they are looking for, and how to present a case, so that it is read as a priority. Another pause, longer than any she had heard from him before. Yes, he said, if you are willing to do that. I am willing. He nodded once, with the slight formal quality of something that meant more than the gesture itself. Then he stood, still holding the paper, and he said, very quietly, Thank you, Elena. It was the first time he had used her name, and meant it to be just her name, not a direction, not an address that preceded an instruction, just her name. She looked back at her book. Let me know when you want to work on the inquiry, she said. I am usually here in the mornings. He left. The library was very quiet. She sat in the chair and looked at the page she had been on, and did not read a word of it for the next 12 minutes. That evening she was in the kitchen making tea, when she heard his footsteps stop at the kitchen doorway. She turned. He was there in the entrance, still in the clothes he had been wearing all day. He stood in the doorway with the specific quality of someone who has arrived somewhere and is not entirely sure what to do now that they have. "Do you want tea?" she asked. A pause. A brief one, but she caught it. "Yes," he said. She made 2 cups. She set them on the kitchen table, rather than the dining room, because the kitchen was the right room for this. Smaller, warmer, not arranged for performance. He sat across from her. He held the cup without drinking, looking at the surface of the tea, as though it were something that needed to be thought about carefully. "He is a good person," he said, eventually, not loudly. As though he were continuing a conversation that had been happening inside himself for some time, and was only now, reluctantly, becoming external. "Tell me about him," she said, and she meant it. And Dominic Ashcroft talked about his brother. He talked about Marcus at 7 years old, deciding to learn the piano, not because anyone suggested it, but because he had heard something on the radio, and determined, with the complete seriousness of a small person who has decided something, that this was what he was going to do. He talked about the months of practice, the gradual competence, the eventual actual beauty of it, and the specific pride of an older brother who had not known how to express that pride without making it awkward, and so had said nothing, and hoped it showed in other ways. He talked about Marcus at 16, who was the kind of person other people gravitated toward, not because he was the most impressive person in the room, but because he was the person in the room who was most genuinely interested in whoever he was talking to. Who had the habit of adopting animals that seemed to need help, a 3-legged cat, a dog someone had left tied to a railing, a rabbit he had found in a hedge and brought home without asking, and then forgetting where he had put them, which led to some memorable domestic situations. He talked about Marcus at 22, in the year before the diagnosis, finishing the 3rd year of an architecture degree, that he approached with the same seriousness he had brought to the piano. Total immersion, genuine skill, the work of someone who was not interested in being approximately good at something, but in understanding it completely. About the girlfriend Clara, who was still present, who visited Edinburgh, and sat in the waiting rooms, and did not complain about any of it. About the dinner, the speech, the housekeeper crying. He talked for 23 minutes. Elena sat across from him with her tea going cold, and she listened, in the full way, not filling the silences, not offering responses that would interrupt the shape of what was being said, not redirecting toward comfort before the actual content had been fully aired. When he stopped, he looked at his cup, and then looked up at her, with the expression of someone who has just noticed they have said significantly more than they intended. "I do not usually," he started. "I know," she said. "It is all right." He held her gaze for a moment. Then, the inquiry. "I will be in the study at 9 tomorrow." "I will be there," she said. He stood. He took his cup to the sink. He stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she had the impression, without any specific evidence for it, just the accumulation of small signals, that he was deciding something. Then he turned and looked at her, and said good night, and left. She washed both cups. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment in the dark, looking at the garden she could not see, and she thought about 23 minutes. Then she went to bed, and she slept better than she had in weeks. She had been at the estate for 10 weeks, when she stopped thinking of it as the estate, and started thinking of it as home, and she noticed the change the way she noticed most things, precisely, without drama, and with the nurse's habit of recording observations before deciding what they meant. It was a Tuesday morning. The kitchen was already warm when she came downstairs, which meant Della had started the range early, which meant it was cold outside, which meant the week was turning in the direction of the kind of weather that made you want soup in the evenings. She registered all of this in the way she registered most of the physical details of the house now, without effort, without the slight cognitive load that comes with unfamiliar environments, with the automatic ease of a person in a place that has become their own. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper that was delivered every morning, physical paper, because Dominic had it delivered every morning even though he read everything else on his phone. She had asked him about this once, why the paper, and he had said, without looking up from whatever he was reading, that he liked the texture of it, and that screens gave him the impression that everything was equally urgent, which was never true, and that print forced a kind of editorial hierarchy that he found clarifying. She had thought about that for a while. She had found it convincing. She was reading the front section when Dominic came down at 7:45, which was earlier than his usual 8:15. He was wearing the dark gray sweater she had come to associate with his informal days. Not professional, not constructed. He stopped when he saw her, not with surprise exactly, but with the slight adjustment of expression that a person makes when they round a corner and find something pleasant that they were not anticipating. "You are early," he said. "Coffee is made," she said. He poured himself a cup and sat across from her. He reached for the second section of the newspaper, which was the business section, and which was what he always took. She continued with the front section. They sat in the morning quiet that had developed between them, and she was aware of it as something that had been built rather than simply arrived, the way a garden is built, intentionally, by degrees, by someone paying attention to what was growing. She had thought, at the beginning, that the domestic closeness would be the most difficult part. The shared meals, the shared mornings, the presence of another person in a house that had its own very specific rhythms. She had expected it to feel like wearing someone else's clothes, recognizable in shape, but wrong in every small way. She could not have said when it stopped feeling like a performance. It had happened the way the light changes in a room as the day progresses, too gradually to notice in any single moment, unmistakably different when you compared morning to evening. The Edinburgh inquiry had been submitted 3 weeks ago, after 2 days of work in which they had sat on opposite sides of the study desk, his desk, not the conference table she had expected to use, which meant he had chosen to bring her into his space rather than going to a neutral one, and she had drafted, while he contributed specific medical details from the specialist's reports, and between them, they had produced something that was both technically precise and narratively clear. Marcus had been accepted for the preliminary consultation last week. He was in Edinburgh now, with his care team, and with Dominic, who had cleared 4 days from a calendar that was never less than full, and had not explained the clearing to any of the people who scheduled things into it. He had come back on Thursday. She had been in the garden when the car came through the gate, and she had seen him get out with his jacket over his arm and stand for a moment at the edge of the driveway, looking at the house with the expression of a person who has been somewhere very difficult and is grateful to be in a place they know. She had gone to meet him. Not because it was required, not because the contract said anything about meeting someone at the end of a driveway. She went because he had been in Edinburgh doing something very hard, and the right thing to do, when someone comes back from something very hard, is to go and meet them. He had looked at her when she appeared at the edge of the garden path. The evening light was warm and late and slightly orange, the particular color of early summer evenings in this part of the country. The first assessment was good, he had said. The markers they needed to see were present. They are proceeding to enrollment. She had said, "I am so glad." And she had meant it with everything she had. He had said thank you, and she had understood that he did not mean only for the inquiry. She thought about that now, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and the morning newspaper, and she thought about the way the past 10 weeks had built something, quietly and without announcement, that she had not anticipated when she signed her name on that thick paper at midnight. She put the newspaper down. "What?" Dominic said, without looking up from his section. She had not spoken. She looked at him. He looked up then. His gray eyes found hers with the directness she had stopped finding startling. "You put the paper down differently," he said. "You usually fold it. You put it flat." She looked at him for a moment without speaking. "You cannot possibly have been paying that much attention," she said. "I pay attention to the things that matter," he said, and he looked back at his newspaper. She sat with that for a long time, her coffee cup in her hand, the kitchen warm around her. It was the same week that she attended the dinner with the Hale family, Patrick Hale, who was one of Dominic's longest professional associations, and his wife Caroline, whose perceptiveness was of the kind that made things slightly easier and slightly more complicated simultaneously. After dessert, while the two men were occupied with a conversation she was not attending to, Caroline leaned toward Elena and said, quietly and with genuine warmth, "You are good for him. I have known Dominic for a very long time. I have never seen him like this." Elena looked at her. "Like what?" she said. Caroline looked across the table to where Dominic was talking to Patrick, and she tilted her head with the slight movement of someone pointing to something they want you to observe, rather than directing you toward it. "Present," she said. "He has always been very good at being in a room. at managing it, at running it, but being in it, actually in it, without managing anything, that I have not seen before. Elena looked too. He was laughing, not the social laugh she had seen him use at the larger events. This was the real kind. The kind that happened because something was actually funny, and the response was not calculated. He was leaning back slightly in his chair, and the laughter had changed the whole arrangement of his face, made it younger, made it, she thought the word before she could stop herself, beautiful. He caught her looking. The laughter did not stop, but something in it shifted, became more directed, became aimed specifically at her, and she looked away first. She was falling in love with him. She identified this fact, that same evening, sitting on the edge of her bed with the lamp on and the window slightly open. She identified it the way she identical findings, directly, without softening, naming the thing, rather than allowing it to exist as a vague sense that she was choosing not to examine. She was falling in love with Dominic Ashcroft, who had entered her life as a business arrangement. A man who paid careful attention to the way she put down a newspaper. A man who had cleared 4 days from his calendar for his brother without being asked, and had not discussed it with anyone who could not add something useful to the situation. A man who had, somewhere between the formal dinners and the morning newspapers and the 23 minutes of real conversation in the kitchen, stopped treating her like a useful arrangement, and started treating her like someone he wanted to continue knowing. She sat with this fact for a long time. She was not afraid of the feeling. She had spent enough time in difficult rooms to know that feelings, even difficult ones, were neither dangerous nor permanent. You named them, you held them honestly, you figured out what they required of you. The moment in the car when Marcus's result came through was one she would remember precisely, the way you remember the moments when the air in a room changes quality. He had been looking at the road, and she had been looking out the window, and the quiet between them had been the particular kind that had become familiar to her over the months. Not empty, not uncomfortable, just the quiet of two people who did not need to fill space. And then he had said the Edinburgh team had called, and she had turned from the window, and he had told her about the markers, and she had said, "That is remarkable." And then the gate had opened, and the moment had moved, and he had started to say something and then hadn't, and she had let it go, because she understood by now that Dominic said things when he was ready to say them, and not before, and pushing was never the right approach with him. But she thought about what he had been about to say. She thought about it in her room that night, lying on top of the covers with the lamp on, and the window slightly open, listening to the garden doing its late spring things below. She thought about the beginning of the sentence, Elena, and the pause that followed it, and the quality of the pause, which was not the pause of someone who had decided not to speak, but the pause of someone who could not yet find the right words for what they wanted to say. She had been in that pause herself, with different things, in different circumstances. She knew what it felt like from the inside. It felt like having something very large in your hands, and not being sure of the grip. She understood, lying there in the late spring dark, that something was happening between them, that neither of them had contracted for, and neither of them was managing. This was, she thought, either very bad or very significant, and the difference between the two depended entirely on what happened next. And what happened next depended on things she could not control, which was itself a thing she was going to have to be at peace with, because she was not a person who could make another person feel what they did not feel, and she would not want to be. She rolled onto her side and looked at the window. Outside, the oak tree was dark and occupied and entirely itself. She thought about the contract date. She thought about 52 days, which was what remained. 52 mornings, 52 evenings. 52 days of the kitchen and the newspaper and the garden and the particular way he said her name sometimes, without anything attached to it, just her name in the air. She thought, 52 days is not very long. She thought, it might be long enough. She did not know what she meant by that exactly. She let it sit. She closed her eyes. Eventually, the garden sounds carried her into sleep, which was one of the things about this room, this house, this particular arrangement of her life. It made sleep possible in a way that her ordinary life had not, for a very long time, and she was grateful for that. She was grateful for a great many things she had not expected to find here. She was grateful, she realized, in a way that had nothing to do with the contract, and everything to do with what she had found inside it. That was a new thought. She held it carefully. And slept. What she was afraid of was the arithmetic. 2 months remained on the contract. 8 weeks. 50-something days, depending on when you started counting. She went to the window. The oak tree was dark against the darker sky. The thrush, if it was a thrush, was somewhere in there, asleep in the particular occupied silence of a bird that has settled. She stood at the window for a long time, and did not make any decisions. The following Saturday, there was a large event, one of the major annual gatherings, the kind that had been on the schedule since before she arrived. They arrived together. They moved through the room the way they had learned to move, which was no longer something that required active thought on her part. At a certain point they found themselves at the edge of the dancing, and Dominic turned to her and said, quietly, "There are people watching." "I know," she said. He held out his hand. This was different from the other times. Not in the technical sense, the movements were the same, but something in the manner of it was different, something in the way his hand rested at her back, not at the professional distance but closer, not in the way of the arrangement but in the way of something older and less managed. When the music ended, he kept hold of her hand for 1 beat longer than the situation required. She noticed. She was certain he noticed that she noticed. Neither of them said anything. In the car on the way home, she looked out the window. He looked straight ahead. The dark moved past them on either side. He said, "The Edinburgh team called today." "And?" she said. Marcus responded to the second cycle of treatment. The markers the protocol requires before the next phase were all present. She turned from the window and looked at him. He was still looking at the road. His jaw was set in the way it set when he was managing something that had more weight than could be easily held. She thought about what it must feel like, to have been in a narrowing room for 14 months, watching options close, and then to have a door open. "That is remarkable," she said. "Yes," he said. A pause. "Elena," he said. "You do not have to say anything," she said. "I know." A pause. "I want to." She waited. But the gate was already opening ahead of them, and the oak trees were dark on either side of the drive, and the house lights were warm in the distance, and whatever he had been going to say, he kept a little longer. She thought, he does everything in pieces. She thought, maybe that is enough. She was less sure she had enough time to find out. In her room that night, she did not sleep easily. She lay in the dark and counted the things she knew about him, the precise things, the ones that had no usefulness to their arrangement, but that had accumulated anyway. She knew he made notes in the margins of his books, and then read them back years later, and could not always remember whether he had agreed with himself. She knew he ran early in the morning, when he could not sleep, which was how she knew when the nights were difficult for him. She knew he had opinions about food that were specific and consistent, and that he did not share them in social settings, which meant they were genuine rather than performed. She knew a great number of things that were not useful. She counted them anyway, in the dark, and eventually she slept. It was the night of the midsummer celebration, and Elena had been at the estate for 5 months, and something happened in the garden in the dark that she would think about for a very long time afterward. The celebration was a tradition that Della had described on the first occasion Elena had heard about it, which was in early May, when Della had been doing preliminary planning and had invited Elena's opinion on the food, which was also the day Elena had understood that she and Della had moved past professional courtesy into something more genuine and mutual. It was held every year, Della explained, pouring the second cup of tea that always appeared when an important conversation was beginning. It had been held every year since long before Dominic had owned the house. The estate had a history that predated him by about a century, and certain things were embedded in it so deeply that they continued without requiring anyone to decide they should. It was not a grand affair. This was people who knew the house, people who worked there, or who had worked there, or who had a connection to it that preceded the current ownership. Some of Dominic's genuine personal circle, a modest number of people who had been in his life long enough to be present without agenda. No press, no business, no performance. Elena had helped plan the food, and this had happened so naturally that she had not thought about it as a decision. She had walked into the kitchen on a morning in May and seen Della comparing 2 menu drafts with the expression of someone in genuine difficulty, and she had said, with honest interest, that the second draft was better in almost every way. Della had looked at her with something that was unmistakably relief, and after that, they had planned things together. The evening itself arrived warm and clear. The garden had been set with amber lights strung between the oak trees and along the stone wall, Della had handled this herself, which meant they were placed in the exact right positions to create the quality of light that made the garden look like something remembered from a long time ago, warm and specific and slightly unreal. People moved through it with the ease of people who were not performing anything, who were genuinely happy to be there. She talked to Patrick Hale's daughter Lily for nearly half an hour about marine biology and the specific tragedy of deep-sea ecosystems. Lily was 19 and opinionated and deeply knowledgeable, and talking to her was one of the most enjoyable conversations Elena had had in months. At some point during the conversation, she became aware that Dominic was watching her. Not in the way she had come to expect from him in the larger events, the quick, confirming assessments. This was different. It was the way you watch a person when you are watching them, and you have stopped pretending otherwise. She excused herself from Lily after a few minutes, and moved toward the edge of the gathering, where the light was thinner, and the stone wall of the east garden made a quiet boundary. He came to stand beside her. "You are good with people," he said, not as a compliment, and not as an observation, but as a fact. He was adding to the set of facts he had been accumulating. "You always have been. I notice it more tonight, because tonight is not a room that requires goodness. It is a room where you can simply be present, and you are." She looked sideways at him. He was looking at the garden, at the amber lights in the trees. "You look different tonight," she said. He glanced at her. "Different how?" "Less arranged," she said. "You are always composed. Tonight you are composed, but there is less scaffolding holding it up." He was quiet for a moment. "Tonight does not require scaffolding," he said. She nodded. There were rooms like that. She thought everyone should have more of them. They stood at the edge of the east garden in the thin light, and the gathering was warm and distant behind them, and the evening was still. Then the power went out. There was no warning, no flicker, no gradual dimming. One moment the garden was warm with amber, and the next it was entirely, completely dark. The lights in the trees, the lights in the windows, the lanterns on the tables. All of them, simply gone. For one full moment, the world was dark, in the complete way that it is only dark far from cities, or when something has interrupted the architecture of light that people build around themselves. Then voices, someone laughing, someone saying something about candles, someone else already moving with a purpose that suggested they knew where they were going. Della's voice, very clear and unhurried, from the direction of the kitchen, planning for this, because she had been doing this for 20 years, and the power could not always be trusted. The candles came back, one by one, amber and uneven and warmer than the lights had been. But Elena and Dominic were at the edge of the east garden, which was further from the candles, and they remained in a depth of dark that the gathering had already moved past. She could not see his face clearly. She could see the outline of him, the shape of his shoulders, the line of his profile against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. She could feel that he was close, in the way you feel a person when the usual visual signals are removed and the other senses compensate. She could hear his breathing. It was steady, which was not different from how it was in other circumstances, but in the dark it was more present. "There is a story about this garden," she said, because the silence felt like it needed something in it. "What kind of story?" "Della told me. The original owner planted it in the early 1900s for his wife. She had been unwell for a long time, and he thought the garden would help. Green things, growing seasons, the rhythm of something that returns every year. She improved. He credited the garden." "What do you think?" he said. "I think she had a husband who paid attention," she said, "and that paying attention is probably underrated as medicine." He was quiet. She became aware, in the way you become aware of things in darkness when the usual cognitive load of vision is removed, of how close they were standing. The closeness that would be unremarkable at the edge of a social gathering, entirely unremarkable, but that was not unremarkable here, where it was just the two of them, and the dark and the faint sounds of the gathering behind them. She did not move. Neither did he. There was something happening that had no name in the contract and no proper place in the arrangement they had made. She could feel it in the quality of the air between them, which was different from the air anywhere else in the garden, specific and aware of itself. His hand came up, slowly, and she felt it at the side of her face. Just the lightest contact, fingertips, barely there, at the edge of her cheekbone and her jaw. And then it was doing something very small and very particular. It was tucking a strand of her hair back from her face, a gesture of such quiet familiarity that it felt as though it had happened many times before, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Then his hand stilled. She could feel it there still, not quite in contact, hovering at the edge of her cheek. She turned her face slightly toward it. He took his hand away. Not abruptly, not in the way of someone who has done something wrong and is correcting it. Slowly, with the deliberateness of someone making a decision that is harder than the alternative. The lights came back all at once. Amber and warm and entire, filling the garden, and the gathering around them became itself again. She looked at him. He was looking at her. His expression was not the composed, managed expression she was accustomed to. It was not exactly open. She did not think he was capable of open in the way that some people were, where everything they felt arrived visibly on their face without filtration. But it was honest. It was the expression of a person who has let something be true, rather than managing it into a different shape. Neither of them spoke. Around them, the gathering resumed. Della's voice from the kitchen called about the desserts. Lily was laughing about something with someone across the garden. The world continued with its ordinary pleasures, entirely unconcerned. She looked at the lights and the trees. The morning after the garden celebration, Elena woke early and lay still in the good quiet of the room and thought about the previous evening with the methodical care she brought to things that mattered. She had felt, in the dark garden, the specific and concentrated pull of a moment that was asking for something neither of them was ready to give it. She had felt his hand at the side of her face and the deliberate withdrawal of it, and she had understood both gestures with equal clarity. The first was an impulse, something that arrived before thought could intercept it. The second was a decision, and the fact that the decision was made in that direction, with that deliberateness, told her something. He was being careful. He was being careful because he was aware of what was happening, and he was not yet ready to let it be the thing it was becoming. And she understood this, because she was also being careful. And she was also aware, and she was also not entirely ready, though she was closer than she had been. She thought about what Caroline Hale had said. Present. She thought about the fact that Caroline had known Dominic for 30 years and had not seen him like this before, and she thought about what that meant. Not for her, not as a confirmation of anything, but as a data point about who he was and what his life had been. A man who was very good at being in a room and not very good at being in it. A man who had managed things for so long that simply being had become unfamiliar, not because he was incapable of it, but because he had spent years in environments that did not require it, and had, over time, let the capability atrophy. She thought about what it must be like to have someone show up in your house, in your life, and simply be present in the full and uncomplicated way that Elena was present, not performing, not managing, just there, reading in the library and making tea, and caring about a brother she had never met. She thought about what it might feel like, for a person who had spent years in a particular kind of very competent and very controlled aloneness, to encounter that. She got up. She went to the window. The garden below was recovering from the previous evening, chairs being rearranged by someone she could see moving slowly across the east path, a small stack of glasses on a tray, the amber lights now unlit and slightly diminished in the morning. The thrush was in the oak tree. She could hear it if she was quiet. She was quiet. She thought, I am going to have to be patient. She thought, I have always been good at patience. I am a nurse. Patience is what nurses are made of. She thought, but this is different. This is patience with something I want, rather than patience with something difficult, and that is a harder kind. She went to make coffee. Dominic was not yet down. She made her coffee and stood at the window, and looked at the garden, and thought about the previous evening, and let herself feel what she felt, without making any decisions about it. She was good at that too, feeling without deciding, observing without acting. It was another thing nursing had taught her. She felt, this morning, something that was tentatively warm. She thought that was probably the most honest thing she could say about it. She drank her coffee. She watched the thrush, and eventually the morning moved on, in the way mornings do, and the day began its ordinary business, and she moved through it with the particular quality of attentiveness that had become, without her quite noticing, the characteristic way she moved through her days in this house. Attentive, present, here. It was, she thought, exactly what she was. She thought about 2 months. About the calendar page she had looked at that morning in the kitchen, before Dominic came down, the way her eye had found the date without meaning to. She thought about a hand at the side of her face, and the specific quality of the moment before it was taken away. She thought about Caroline Hale saying, "Present." Later, when the gathering wound down, and the people she knew well lingered for a last cup of tea, and then gradually, warmly, made their ways home, she walked through the quieting house to the north wing staircase. She stopped in the corridor without planning to. She stood very still. She had come here for one reason. She had been entirely honest with herself about that reason. She was not a person who lied to herself, which meant she was not a person who was unaware of why she had made the choices she had made. She had not come here for a hand in the dark. She had not come here for mornings in the kitchen, or 23 minutes of real conversation, or the specific gravity of a person who put a room in his house in order in February, and did not say why. She had not come here for any of this. And yet. She pressed her fingertips to her cheek, very briefly, and then took them away. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark for a long time before she slept, and she thought about love, which was the word she had been careful not to use, even in her own thoughts, and which she noticed she was now using, even in her own thoughts. She thought, this is going to be complicated. She thought, it already is. She thought, I still have 2 months. And then, eventually, she slept. It started at 6 in the morning, with a message from a number she did not recognize, which turned out to be a journalist asking for comment on a story that had already been published. Elena read the message standing in her bedroom with the light still off. She read it twice, then she put the phone face down on the bedside table and stood very still for a moment, which was what she did when she was deciding how to respond to something important. She turned the phone back over. She read the message a third time. Then she got up and got dressed in exactly 5 minutes, because she had been a nurse for 10 years, and she had learned that the first thing you do in a situation that has just changed is get yourself dressed and oriented and present. Gerard's message arrived while she was tying her shoes. It was, as always, brief and precise. A story had been published the previous evening by a news outlet with established connections to Senator Drake's office. It described Elena as a woman of uncertain provenance who had entered Dominic Ashcroft's life in a period of 6 weeks before an unannounced marriage. It quoted unnamed sources close to the Ashcroft board, who described the arrangement as a strategic maneuver ahead of the acquisition vote. It named no illegality. It asserted no specific untruth. It simply arranged facts and timing in a way that created the impression of a story it was not quite telling. Dominic was already in the sitting room when she came downstairs. Gerard was there, standing with his phone, his manner the precise and unruffled efficiency of someone who had been awake for longer than she had, and was already 3 steps into managing it. A tablet was open on the desk. The story was on the screen. She came in and stood by the desk and read it. She read it the way she read everything that mattered, all the way through, without skimming, paying attention to not just what was said but what was not said, the architecture of the implication. When she finished, she set the tablet down. He does not have evidence, she said. He has an argument. It is a good argument. It is well assembled, and it has the right emotional shape, but it is not supported by anything concrete. Dominic looked at her. He was standing, not sitting, which was unusual for him at this hour. That distinction will matter less than you might hope, he said. It matters to the response, she said. If there were concrete evidence, you would need to answer it directly. Because there is not, you do not address it at all. You answer the argument by behaving as though it is not worth answering. Gerard lowered his phone. He was listening to her. The board, she said. How did they respond overnight? 2 of the 3 uncertain members have already contacted my office, Dominic said. The 3rd has not, which is either a good sign or a very bad one. What did the 2 say? That they wanted to understand the situation before making any assessment. That is a reasonable position, she said. They are not declaring opposition. They are declaring uncertainty. That is different, and it is manageable. Dominic looked at her steadily. You need to be visible, she said. Today, if there is any way to make it happen, not in response to this, you never respond to a thing like this directly, because responding elevates it and gives it the credibility it does not currently have. But visible, ordinary, entirely uninteresting. You and I, somewhere public, doing something unremarkable. There is a venue event this afternoon, Gerard said, from across the room. It was already on the schedule. Then we attend it, she said. Dominic was quiet for a moment. Elena, he said. She waited. You do not have to do this, he said, standing in front of cameras and journalists and people who are looking for something to find. That is not in the contract. You fulfilled what was asked of you. This is beyond it. She looked at him. She thought about 5 months of mornings. She thought about the Edinburgh inquiry and the garden and 23 minutes of real conversation. She thought about a hand in the dark and a man who had learned to say thank you like it cost him something, which meant it was real. I know, she said. I am going anyway. The afternoon event was a gallery opening in the central part of the city, which had been on the calendar as a relatively minor appearance. Today it was something else. They arrived on schedule. She wore a dress from the wardrobe, something she had chosen herself, a particular color of warm amber that she thought would read well in photographs, and that she also, separately, liked. She had spent no time on the question of how she would behave. That had settled itself without deliberation. She was going to behave the way she always behaved, which was the only honest response to a situation in which the accusation was that she was performing. They moved through the room. She shook hands and had conversations, and found herself genuinely interested in several of the works on display, which helped because genuine interest was the most convincing thing in any room. She stood beside Dominic with the ease of practice, and also with something more than ease, something she could not entirely account for, which was simply that standing beside him felt natural, in a way it had not 5 months ago. Afterward, he addressed the small gathering that had assembled near the entrance. He was brief. He did not mention Drake. He did not acknowledge the story. He spoke for 4 minutes about the gallery, and the work it did, and the artists it supported, and then he spoke for 30 seconds about being glad to be there with his wife, and the 30 seconds were quieter and plainer than the 4 minutes, and because of that, they were more convincing. He said her name. He said, "My wife." And the way he said it was not strategic. The way he said it, she realized in the quiet of the room, was true. She was standing at his side, and she did not look at the cameras. She looked at him, and he looked back at her, and for a moment the room was entirely irrelevant. Then a journalist asked a question, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary business of managing it. But she carried it with her, that moment, for the rest of the afternoon. Afterward, in the car, they were quiet. "The board," she said, "the third member, called while we were inside. He is satisfied. The vote proceeds." She looked out the window, exhaled slowly. "Good. Because of you," he said. "Because we went," she said. "That is different." He looked at the road. "Elena." "Yes? I need to." He stopped, started again. "There are 31 days remaining on the contract." "I know," she said. "I want you to know that whatever you—" Another stop. He was not usually like this. He was usually the most articulate person in any room. She thought it was significant, what the stopping meant. "Dominic," she said, gently. He looked at her. "Let the 31 days happen," she said. "Let us get to the other side of it. Then we have the conversation." He held her gaze for a long moment. "All right," he said. The gate opened ahead of them. The oak trees closed over the drive. The house was warm in the distance, lit and quiet. She thought, 31 days. She thought, it is enough time, if we use it. That evening, after dinner, she was in the library reading when he came to the doorway. "The contract," he said. She looked up. "There are 31 days remaining," he said. He was not looking at her the way he usually looked at her. He was looking at her with something that was unmistakably careful. "I want you to know that whatever you choose to do at the end of that period—" He stopped. She put the book down. He tried again. "I am aware that our arrangement has—" Another stop. It was so unusual to see him struggle with words that she felt, unexpectedly, a warmth in her chest that was almost painful. "Dominic," she said. He looked at her. The press event at the gallery was over by 4 o'clock, and the drive back to the estate took 45 minutes, and in those 45 minutes Elena experienced something she had not expected to experience in the context of Drake's campaign against them, which was a small and specific triumph. Not victory. Not the resolution of the situation, which was ongoing and would remain ongoing for at least the duration of the board vote. But a trim, contained, actual triumph. They had appeared. They had been unremarkable. They had given the story nothing to feed on. And the board, or 2/3 of it, had noticed. She thought about what Drake must be doing right now. He had made a move. The move had not produced the response he intended. He would, as Dominic had said, try again. He was experienced, and he was committed, and he would not abandon the strategy simply because one piece of it had not worked. But he had also, she thought, made an error. He had assumed, she could see the shape of the assumption in the architecture of what he had done, that a hired companion, which was how he had described her, would be either frightened or insufficiently skilled to manage the public aspect of this situation. He had assumed that pressure would produce either visible distress or visible overcompensation, both of which would be useful to him. He had not, she thought, anticipated someone with 10 years of experience, staying calm and useful in rooms where people were frightened and in pain, which was not a profile he would have been looking for when he researched her background. She thought, he underestimated what he was dealing with. She thought, that is useful. She did not say any of this to Dominic. She stored it, the way she stored most useful information, for the moment when it would be most relevant. They drove in quiet, which was comfortable, and the city fell away behind them, and the trees came back on either side of the road, and the gate opened, and the house was warm in the distance. She thought about the 31 days, and the conversation she had asked him to postpone. She thought, we are using the time well. She thought, I hope he knows that. Later that evening, after the library conversation in which he had tried to say something, and she had asked him to wait, after she had picked up her book and he had stayed in the chair, which was the thing that mattered most about that particular evening, that he stayed in the chair for 40 minutes, without explanation or apology, simply present in the room with her. She had looked up once, and found him looking at her. He had not looked away first. She had. She had looked back at her book, and she had read 2 pages without remembering a word of them, and then she had found the thread of the story again, and the evening had continued in its quiet warmth, and at 10 o'clock she had said good night and gone upstairs. She had not slept immediately. She had lain in the dark and thought about staying in chairs, about how a person who was very good at leaving rooms, at removing himself from situations that were not operationally useful, at being elsewhere, when elsewhere was more efficient, had stayed in a chair for 40 minutes, because she was in the room, and he wanted to be where she was. She thought, that tells me something. She thought, I know what it tells me. She turned over and pulled the blanket up, and eventually, in the warm quiet of the room she had come to love, she slept. Sit down, she said. He sat in the chair across from her, and the library was warm and quiet around them. She said, I know what the contract says. I remember every word of it, and I know what it does not say. She looked at him steadily. But I think we should let the 31 days happen, and then talk about this. When it is over, when we are on the other side of it. He was quiet. Something moved in his expression that she had no precise word for. You are asking me to wait, he said. I am asking both of us to wait, she said. Because I think this deserves to happen without a deadline attached to it. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. She picked up her book. He stayed in the chair. He did not pick up his phone or a newspaper or anything else. He just sat in the library with her, in the warm quiet, and she read, and he stayed, and neither of them said anything else. It was, she thought, one of the best evenings she could remember. She started packing on a Wednesday, and she had not meant to. She had been looking for a cardigan. It was a specific one, gray, with the kind of buttons that were easy to do one-handed, which she valued, because she had developed the habit of putting it on, while still holding something else, usually a book or a cup. She had not been able to find it for 3 days, and she had finally decided to do a thorough search of the wardrobe. She found the cardigan in the very back, behind a winter coat she had not touched since March. She also found, behind the coat and beside the cardigan, her original 2 bags. She stood with the cardigan in one hand and the bag in the other. The bag was exactly as it had been in January. The straps were slightly worn at the attachment points from years of use. There was a small pen mark on the front pocket, from an incident she did not precisely remember. It was the bag she had packed in January, The one she had brought to this house believing she was coming for a year, and leaving with nothing more complicated than she arrived with. She sat on the edge of the bed. She counted. 27 days. That was what remained when she looked at the calendar that morning. She sat for a long time. She was a person who understood things by acknowledging them clearly. She had always been this way. The habit had been reinforced by nursing, which required you to look at what was actually in front of you, rather than what you wished were there. A wound was a wound. A test result was a test result. She did not want to leave. This was clear. She had known it for weeks. She had named it to herself in various rooms at various times, without making it mean anything operational, because she did not know what it could mean, and she had the nurse's instinct of not acting on incomplete information. But the bag in her hand made it feel operational whether she wanted it to or not. She put the bag down. She put on the cardigan. She went downstairs. The afternoon was overcast, which suited her mood in the way that weather can suit a mood, not because it matches it, but because it removes the requirement to be cheerful. She went to the garden, to the east path, past the rose beds that were past their peak, past the bench where she had sat on her first mornings here. She had sat on that bench and felt, very clearly, the strangeness of the house, the foreign quality of every surface and sound, the particular self-consciousness of being somewhere where you are performing a version of yourself you have not quite inhabited yet. She sat on the same bench now and felt none of those things. That evening at dinner she was quieter than usual. She was aware of it, and she was aware that he was aware of it, but he said nothing directly. He talked about a call with the Edinburgh team, which had gone well. Marcus would be returning home in 3 weeks. The research team was optimistic. "That is wonderful," she said. She meant it without reservation. "Because of you," he said. "Because of the science," she said. "And because Marcus is the kind of person who responds to things. I read his case history. In the materials you shared. He has never stopped trying." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "He has not." After dinner she went upstairs and sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She pulled up the apartment rental listings in the city. She had not been home since January. Her belongings were in storage at her cousin Kate's. The apartment had been sublet while she was away, and she would need to find somewhere new when she returned. She looked at the listings for a while. She noted the prices. She noted that the apartments nearest the clinic were the least available. She made a few notes. Then she closed the laptop. She was doing what she sometimes did when she was afraid of something. She was making practical preparations for it, as a way of making it feel manageable. It was a good strategy in most contexts. She was not sure it was a good strategy here. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. She was normally an excellent sleeper. It was one of the things she had trained herself into, because shift work required it. But tonight the room, which she had come to love, felt large around her in a way it had not in months. At 2 in the morning she gave up. She got up, found the cardigan again, and went downstairs. The kitchen light was the kind of light that exists to be turned on by one person at a time, in the middle of the night. She turned it on and stood at the counter with the kettle. She was in the act of filling it from the tap when she heard footsteps. She turned. Dominic was in the doorway. Dark shirt, dark trousers, the specific expression she had come to recognize as him also not sleeping. It had happened before, during the Drake period, the night before Marcus went to Edinburgh. She recognized the look. Something was sitting with him that would not lie flat. "You could not sleep," she said. "No." He came to the counter and stood beside her. "You either." "I have been thinking," she said. "About?" She looked at the kettle. She said, "About 27 days." He was quiet. She made the tea. 2 cups, because she always made 2 when she made tea for herself at night, and because that had started as a habit she had formed early on, without thinking about it, and had never examined. She brought the cups to the table. She sat across from him. She said, "I want to stay." She had not planned to say it tonight. She had had a plan. The plan was that she would let the 27 days happen, and she would be patient, and on the last day or the day after, she would say what needed to be said, and he would say what needed to be said, and they would begin again, from a place of clarity. But she was a nurse who had watched people wait too long to say things that mattered, and she was a person who had spent 10 years understanding the difference between composure and delay, and she looked at him across the table in the middle of the night kitchen and she said it. "I want to stay," she said again. Not because of the contract terms, not because of the settlement, because this arrangement, or whatever it has become, has turned into something that I did not plan for, and cannot reasonably pretend is not there, and I do not want to leave it. She looked at him steadily. I would rather say it now, while there is still time for it to mean something, than not say it, and spend the next 27 days wondering. He was very still across the table. He was holding the cup with both hands. He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, which was his most characteristic quality, and also the one she found most complicated, and she sat in it without flinching, because looking away first was not what she did. He said her name. She waited. I have been trying, he said, and stopped. He tried again. I have spent approximately 6 weeks trying to work out how to say something to you. He looked at the table briefly, then back at her. I am not practiced at this. I want you to understand that this is not a skill I have. I have managed things for most of my adult life. Relationships, when they have existed, have been managed also. Managed is the wrong word for what I am trying to say. Then say the right word, she said gently. A pause. I do not want you to leave, he said. I am aware that I cannot ask you to stay on the terms of the contract, because the contract is ending. I am not asking on those terms. I am asking you to stay because... He stopped. He found the words with something that looked like effort, and she loved him for making the effort, because it was real effort, not performance. Because you have made this house different, he said, not in the sense of furniture or arrangement, in the sense of what it is to be here. You have been present in a way that I did not know I was missing. I have spent a great deal of time in this house not being present in it. You showed me that was a choice I was making, by making a different one. She looked at him. The person who goes to the morning library, he said. The person who makes tea at 2 in the morning and does not complain about being awake. The person who found a clinical trial for my brother at midnight on a Tuesday and left the information on my desk and did not ask for anything for it. A pause. The person who puts the newspaper down flat. She laughed. She could not help it. It came out softly, not loudly, but genuinely. The corner of his mouth moved. You could have said something before 2 in the morning, she said. You could have too, he said. I just did. Yes, he said. You always go first. Not an accusation, an observation, something in between. She put her hand on the table between them. He looked at it for a moment. He put his hand over hers. They sat in the kitchen at 2 in the morning with their tea going cold, and the house quiet around them, and neither of them said anything else, because they were both people who understood that there were moments that should not be covered over with words, and this was one of them. It was full. It was entirely full of everything that had been growing, without permission or plan, for 5 months. 27 days remained on the contract. She found she was not thinking about the contract. She was thinking about 23 minutes of conversation, about a boy with a piano. She was thinking about a hand in the garden in the dark. She was thinking about February, and what it means when someone clears out a room before they need to. She held his hand. He held hers. Outside, the night was still. In the mornings after rain, the estate had a quality she had not found language for in all the months she had lived there. She had tried, occasionally, when she was on the phone with her mother and describing the place. Her mother had never seen it, still had not seen it, though that was going to change. She had tried to describe the morning after rain quality, the way the garden held the water in the leaves, so that when the light finally arrived it came through an extra layer of clarity, each leaf both illuminated and transparent, the wet paths dark and reflective, the air carrying the particular combination of cold stone and growing things, and old oak that she had come to associate with something she did not quite have a word for. In the days after the 2 o'clock kitchen conversation, something settled between them that had not been settled before. It was not dramatic. She had half expected that after saying what she had said, I want to stay, out loud, in the kitchen, to his face, the dynamic between them would shift abruptly, would become either very awkward or very different. What happened instead was quieter. The quality of things between them was simply more itself, less managed, less held at arm's length. He came to find her in the garden one afternoon when she was reading on the east bench. He did not have a specific reason. He sat down at the other end of the bench and looked at the garden for a while, and then they talked. not about anything significant, about the roses, which were past their peak, about the state of the lawn on the west side, about something he had read that morning that he found interesting and had thought she might too. He summarized it for her, and she asked questions, and they sat in the autumn-adjacent warmth of a late summer afternoon, and it was, she thought, entirely ordinary. Exactly as ordinary as she had always wanted things between them to be. She thought about the conversation at 2 in the morning, about his hands over hers on the table, about the 27 days that had become 26 and then 25. She thought about what he had said, "You always go first." She thought, yes, I do, and I will, and that is all right. She had called her mother on the evening after the kitchen conversation, not to tell her everything. She was not ready for that yet, and Margaret Hartley had always been a patient woman who understood that some stories needed to arrive in their own time, but to tell her that things were good, that they were better than good, that she was, for the first time in a very long time, in a place where she felt genuinely settled. Her mother had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "I am glad." And then, because she was Margaret Hartley, and she had always known her daughter, "I told you so." Elena had laughed. She had laughed in the sitting room of the north wing, with the evening light coming through the window. Laughed in the way you laugh when someone who loves you has been right about something you could not have admitted earlier. Laughed with all the relief of a person who has been found. Her mother had laughed too, which was one of the best sounds in the world, and they had talked for an hour about other things, the garden, and whether Margaret might be able to visit in the autumn, and the documentary she was watching, and Marcus's progress, about which Elena had told her enough to be honest, without telling her more than was appropriate. After she hung up, she sat in the sitting room for a while longer, in the evening quiet, and she thought about what it meant to have arrived at a place where she could have that conversation, where she could say things were good and mean it completely. She had arrived here in January, in a car in the dark with 2 bags and a number, and a mother who needed her. She was still here in August, in a house she loved, with a man she loved, and a morning room with the right light. The distance between those 2 facts was not a road she had expected to travel. She was glad, enormously and practically and specifically glad, that she had. The closest word she had was home, which was also the word she had been using in her head for the past month without quite being ready to say it out loud to anyone. This morning was a rain morning. She came downstairs at 7:30, and the kitchen was already warm, because Della came in early on these mornings, which Elena had noticed and understood as a kind of provision. Warmth in the kitchen when the garden is wet was Della's theory of care expressed in practical terms. She made coffee. She stood at the window with her cup. Behind her, she heard footsteps she recognized without looking. Dominic came to stand beside her. He poured himself a cup. He stood at the window. They looked at the garden together. "The thrush is back," he said. She looked to the oak tree. There, a small, round, precise shape on a low branch, regarding the wet garden with the authority of a creature that had decided this was its territory and saw no reason to doubt the decision. "It was never gone," she said. "It just was not always visible." He glanced at her. She was looking at the bird. "How long do you need?" he said. The question was the one they had both been living around since the night in the kitchen, since the hands on the table, since the 27 days became 26, and then 25, and then fewer. Since the thing they had both said was real, had been given space to be real, without the urgency of the contract's deadline pressing from one side. "I have practical things," she said. "My belongings are at Kate's. I should speak to the clinic coordinator about a more permanent arrangement, rather than the temporary leave understanding we have now. There are some administrative things connected to the apartment sublet that need to be resolved. Take the time you need for those," he said. She turned from the window. "I want to be honest about the rest of it," she said, because she was always honest, and she was not going to stop being so now of all times. "I am not a person who belongs to this world in the way your professional connections do. I did not come from it. I will not always know the right thing to wear, or the right thing to say, in rooms I have not been in before, and there will be people who notice that, and who have opinions about it. There are people who have opinions about everything," he said. "I have spent 15 years managing opinions. I am quite good at it." "I know," she said. "I am not saying it is an obstacle. I am saying you should go in with accurate information." "I have accurate information," he said. "I have had accurate information about you since January. The information has consistently suggested that you are the most capable person I have encountered in some years. And I have encountered a very large number of people. She looked at him. That is almost a compliment. It is a compliment, he said, without any particular self-consciousness. I am not usually given to them, but I am learning that some things are worth saying directly, rather than allowing to be inferred. She turned back to the window. The thrush had hopped to a higher branch, unhurried. Marcus, she said. He wants to meet me properly. He has been asking about it since the first week in Edinburgh, Dominic said. He has also been composing what I understand is a fairly extensive thank you speech, which I suspect will be delivered all at once and without warning. She smiled. I look forward to it. You should prepare yourself, Dominic said. He is. A pause that contained what she thought was genuine affection, wearing the disguise of mild concern. A great deal. When he is well. I can manage a great deal, she said. I know, he said. And there was something in how he said it that was different from a statement of capability. It was something closer to certainty. They were quiet for a moment. There is something I want to show you, he said. He led her through the house, past the library, past the study, down the east corridor to the room at the end of the wing that she had passed many times and never opened, because the door was always closed and she had not asked. He pushed it open with slight effort, the door stiff with the morning damp. The room was full of light. The windows faced southeast, tall and uncurtained, and the morning came through them in the particular way it had been coming through them for 100 years, falling on pale walls and wide old floorboards that gleamed in the wet morning clarity. The room was empty of furniture, just the floors and the walls and the light and the smell of old wood and something clean that might have been the rain. She stood in the doorway. What is this room? She asked. My grandmother called it the morning room, he said. She used it for reading. After her, it became storage. After the storage was cleared out, it was nothing. He looked at the room, not at her. I had the storage moved in February. She turned to look at him. February, their second month, before Edinburgh, before the garden at midsummer, before the kitchen at 2 in the morning. February, when she had still been learning the shape of the house, and he had still been, in her estimation, largely impenetrable. Why in February? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because by February, he said, I was beginning to understand that there was a difference between a useful arrangement and a person. She looked at the room again. The light was extraordinary. It was the kind of room that would be, in the mornings, exactly the right quality of bright without being harsh. The east light that she had been missing in her sitting room, which faced north and was beautiful in the afternoons, but dim in the mornings. This room was built for mornings. This was in February, she said again. Yes. Before you knew if I would stay. Before I knew if you would want to, he said, which is different. The contract always had the option for extension, which I was aware of. Whether you would want to was not something I could predict. She walked into the room. She stood in one of the long lines of light that came through the southeast window. She could feel it on her face, warm for a wet morning. He came and stood beside her. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, steady, present, without any of the careful management of the earlier months. Marcus, she said, is going to be completely impossible at dinner. Something happened to his face. A real smile. Not the managed social version. Not the slight mouth movement she had learned to recognize as the closest he usually came. A real one, with his whole face in it. He is going to like you immediately, he said, within approximately 5 minutes, and he is going to tell you so, at length, while I pretend it is not happening. I can handle that, she said. I know, he said. She looked at the room around them. The light was everywhere, warm and morning-specific, the kind of light that would be here at this quality, for a certain number of weeks in this season, and then shift and change as the year moved, the kind of light that came back. She thought about what she had come here with in January, 2 bags, $47, a contract on thick paper, and a very clear understanding of why she was doing what she was doing, and what it would and would not involve. She thought about what she was standing in now. I want to put bookshelves in here, she said, along the north wall, floor to ceiling, like the library. Tell me what you want, he said. I will have them made. She shook her head. I want to choose them, with you. I want to go somewhere and argue about whether the shelves should be walnut or ash, and whether the spacing between the shelves should be for novels or for the larger books that do not fit on standard shelves. He looked at her. I do not know anything about shelving. You know about oak trees, she said. You know which section of the newspaper is correct. You will have opinions about shelving, I guarantee it. He was quiet for a moment, and then, walnut, he said. Obviously. She laughed. They stood in the morning room with the light coming through the tall windows, and she held his hand, and he held hers, and outside the thrush was in the oak tree doing exactly what it intended to do with this particular morning, and the garden was wet and clear and entirely itself, and the house was warm behind them. She thought, I am going to call my mother today. I am going to tell her everything. She thought, she is going to say she knew. She thought, looking at the light in the morning room, and the man standing beside her in it, I think I knew too. Not in January. Not in February. But somewhere, at some point, without being able to locate the exact moment, I knew. She tightened her hand in his. He tightened his in hers. They stood in the morning room, and it was morning, and there was nothing else that needed to happen. The day the contract expired was a Thursday in late September, and the morning came in the particular way that autumn mornings came to that part of the country, with a low, clean light that came in at an angle different from summer's, that lit the garden differently, that made the lavender on the east path look silver in the early hour before the warmth arrived. Elena had not set an alarm. She woke at her usual time, which was early enough to have the kitchen to herself for 20 minutes, which was something she had come to value as a specific good thing about mornings, rather than a circumstance she had simply accepted. She lay still for a moment in the familiar dark of the room, the dark that was not quite dark, because the curtains let through the edges of the morning, and she let the room come back to her. The books on the shelf, the carved wooden bird on the windowsill, the sound of the oak tree moving, faintly, in the early air. She thought, today. She thought, yes. She got up. She found the cardigan. She went downstairs. The kitchen had the quality it always had at this hour, not empty, because the house was never empty in the way that a house without people in it is empty, but held, gathered in itself. The range was warm because Della kept it warm through the night in September, which was one of the domestic courtesies Elena had come to rely on without thinking about it. She made coffee. She stood at the window. The garden was doing its September thing, which was different from its summer thing. The roses were finished. The lavender, which she and Dominic had planted in late July, on an afternoon that had run to 3 hours, because he had, as she had predicted, strong opinions about spacing, was still there, still holding its shape even past peak, the stems woody and the color faded, but the rows of it intact, along the east path, further than she had originally planned, because he had said, calmly, that if you were going to plant something meant to last, you might as well commit. The morning in the morning room became something they did regularly in the weeks that followed. Not every morning, not formally, not by schedule, but often enough that it became a thing. The morning room, the right light, the two of them in it. Sometimes with coffee, sometimes without. Sometimes talking, sometimes not. Sometimes she read, and he stood at the window and thought about whatever he was thinking about, and sometimes he sat on the floor with his back against the wall, which was something she had not expected from him, and which delighted her in a way she chose not to examine too closely, because delight was a large word, and she wanted to use it carefully. The bookshelves became a real project. They went, on a Thursday afternoon, to a furniture workshop on the edge of the city, where a woman named Ruth made built-in shelving for houses that were old enough to need shelving that understood their proportions. Ruth showed them walnut, and ash, and oak, and something pale that she said was maple. Dominic stood with his arms crossed and looked at the samples with the expression of a man who had genuine opinions and was restraining the rate at which he expressed them. Elena watched him with the specific pleasure of watching someone be themselves in an unexpected context. Walnut, she said, to hurry things along. Obviously, he said. Ruth smiled at both of them, in the way of someone who had worked in this business long enough to know when she was dealing with people who already knew what they wanted and were simply working through the ritual of choosing. The shelves were going to take 6 weeks to build. They left a deposit and drove back through the city in the late afternoon light, and Dominic said, unprompted, that Ruth's work was clearly excellent and he thought the maple had been a genuine option, and he was interested in why she had dismissed it so quickly. She turned from the window. "Because the morning room needs warmth," she said. "It has cold light. Walnut brings warmth. Maple would have made it feel like a library, which is what the other room is for." He looked at her. "You had thought about this." "I had thought about it," she said. A pause. "Before or after I showed you the room?" "After," she said. "The same morning, actually. I stood in the light and I thought, walnut, north wall, floor to ceiling, spacing for the mixed collection, because it is going to be a real collection, not a curated one." He was quiet. He looked at the road. "I like that," he said. Eventually, she faced forward. "I know," she said. Marcus came home on a Wednesday. She had been at the clinic when the car arrived, and she came back in the late afternoon to find him installed in the sitting room with a cup of tea and an expression of total comfort, as though he had been sitting in that particular chair for years. He was thinner than the photograph on the desk, but his eyes were the same as the photograph. Entirely direct, entirely warm, entirely interested in whoever was in front of him. He stood when she came in. He was taller than she expected. He had Dominic's coloring, but a completely different arrangement of it. Where Dominic was contained and controlled, Marcus was all surface, all expression, nothing held back. "You are Elena," he said. "I am," she said. He crossed the room and hugged her with the ease of someone for whom physical warmth was simply the natural expression of gladness, which was clearly what he was feeling. She hugged him back. Over his shoulder, she could see Dominic standing in the doorway, with a cup of tea in his hand, and an expression that was composed in the familiar way, and also, underneath the familiar composure, unmistakably moved. She thought, there it is. She thought, there is the thing he does not have words for. Marcus pulled back and held her at arm's length, and looked at her with those direct, warm eyes. "You found the Edinburgh trial," he said, "at midnight, on a Tuesday." "I did," she said. "You need to know," he said, with the complete seriousness of someone making a formal declaration, "that I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be equal to that." "That is very kind," she said, "though entirely unnecessary." "I know it is unnecessary," he said. "I am going to do it anyway." Behind him, she heard Dominic say, very quietly, "I told you he was a great deal." She looked past Marcus at him. "You were right," she said. "I am going to enjoy this very much." Marcus looked between them with the expression of someone who has just confirmed something he had suspected. He sat back down in his chair with his tea and he said, with great satisfaction, "Good." It was, Elena thought, a very good word. She was still smiling about that, slightly, now. His footsteps on the stairs were familiar enough that she knew, from their pace and the specific pause on the third step, that he had been awake for a while. Not all night, but for some time. Thinking, probably. He thought in the early morning, in the hours before the house became occupied with its practical requirements. She knew this because she had learned to read the quality of his mornings as an indication of his nights, which was the kind of knowledge that only came from sustained attention over a long period. He came into the kitchen and looked at her. He looked at the window. He looked at the calendar on the wall, Della's calendar, with the bird photographs, the one he had told her he found unexpectedly cheerful, which had been said with such slight self-deprecation that she had immediately loved it. He looked at the date. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He poured himself coffee. He came to stand beside her. They looked at the garden together, the two of them at the window, the way they had been doing on these mornings for most of the past year. On the counter between them, she had placed the original contract. She had retrieved it from the green folder in the sitting room 2 days ago, and set it here without comment. It had been on the counter for 2 days, between them, present and unaddressed. He looked at it now. "There is a provision on page 7, he said. His voice was even and careful. "Voluntary extension." "I know," she said. "It allows for renegotiation of terms, new conditions, a revised timeline." "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I do not want to renegotiate terms," he said. She looked at him. He turned from the window to face her properly, and his expression was the one she had come to know as his honest one, not open in the way of someone who has never learned to guard themselves, but open in the way of someone who has learned precisely and intentionally when to set the guard aside, which required far more effort, and was correspondingly far more meaningful. I want to remove them entirely, he said. Terms, conditions, duration, all of it. She did not say anything. I am aware, he said, that I am not an easy person. I am aware that there are ways in which I am, that the way I approach things, the way I have spent most of my life managing everything rather than simply being in it. I am aware that these are not qualities that make a person easy to be near. He paused. You have been near me for 12 months, and I am aware that you have seen all of it, including the parts that are not, the parts that are. Dominic, she said. He stopped. I know you, she said. I have been learning you for 12 months. I know the study and the newspaper and the third step on the stairs, and the fact that you care about your brother more than you have the vocabulary for it, and the fact that you cleared a room out in February when you did not know if I would stay. She held his gaze. I know you. I do not need the explanation. He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was very still. She reached out and picked up the contract from the counter. She held it in both hands. She felt the weight of it, the actual physical weight, which was not much, but which carried everything it represented. The midnight signing, her mother's bills, the thick paper and the plain black ink, the number, her name already printed on the first page. She had come here with $47 and 2 bags, and a reason. She had found something that had no price. She tore the contract in half. The sound was clean and complete, paper tearing in a quiet kitchen in the early morning, when everything was clear, and the garden was silver, and the thrush was somewhere in the oak tree. She held the 2 halves. She looked at them. Then she set them on the counter beside the coffee cups. Dominic looked at the 2 halves of the paper. Then he looked at her. I am not leaving, she said. I was never going to leave. You knew that. I hoped it, he said. That is different. Yes, she said, it is. You are right. He crossed the kitchen. He was not an impulsive person. He was not a person who moved without thought. Everything he did was usually considered first, then executed, then reviewed. That was simply how he was. She knew this as she knew everything else about him, precisely, without judgment, as a fact of who he was. But he crossed the kitchen without any of that, and he stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and she said, hello. And he said, hello. And then he put his arms around her, not with the professional placement of the early months, not with the maintained distance of the arrangement, not with any calculation at all. Simply and entirely, the way you hold a person you intend to go on holding. She leaned into it. Outside, the lavender on the east path was moving slightly in the early air. The thrush was in the oak tree, occupied with whatever thrushes are occupied with in the first hour of a September morning. The garden was silver and wet and entirely itself. The house was warm behind them and full of books and the particular accumulated quality of a life that was actually being lived in it. She thought, I need to call my mother. She thought, Marcus is coming home in 10 days. She thought, we need to decide about the shelves in the morning room, because Walnut is obviously correct, but the spacing is still unresolved. She thought, with her face against his shoulder, I came here for one reason, and found something that has no name in any contract I have ever read. The East Garden, she said. What about it? He said. I want to plant something else. Something larger than lavender. Something that takes years to establish, and is better at 30 than at 5. He was quiet for a moment. What kind of something? I do not know yet. We need to look into it. We need to find out what grows well here, what the soil supports, what will come back every year without being asked. There will be an expert, he said. Someone who knows this specifically. I want to choose it ourselves, she said, with advice, but ourselves. I want to stand in the East Garden and make a decision about something that will still be there in 30 years. A pause. All right, he said. She stayed where she was. He stayed where he was. The kitchen was warm, and the coffee was cooling, and the morning was doing what it does, which is continuing, regardless of what anyone has decided. She thought about January, about the drive through the gate in a dark car with 2 bags in the boot, about facing forward and telling herself that 12 months was not so long, about the way the oak trees had closed over the driveway, and the house had come into view. Not the cold, imposing thing she had expected, but a house, actual and specific, with trees that had opinions. She thought about the distance between that morning and this one. It was not a distance of escape, it was not a distance of endurance or performance, or of getting through something difficult until it was over. It was the distance of arrival, the kind that is not dramatic, that does not happen all at once, that happens by degrees, in mornings and evenings and conversations and kitchens and gardens and rooms that get cleared out in February without explanation. She had arrived. She knew what that felt like now. The morning room, she said. What about it? I want to be in it this morning, after this. It will be the right light, he said. I know, she said. That is why. She felt him exhale, slightly, against her hair. Not a sigh, something quieter than that. Something that was simply the sound of a person who has been holding something carefully for a very long time, and has set it down. They stayed there for a while. The coffee went cold. The morning advanced. The garden continued in its September way, unhurried and clear, and absolutely unimpressed by the fact that anything was happening inside the house. Eventually she lifted her head. Come on, she said, before the light shifts. He let her go. Not all at once, but by degrees, which was how he did everything. They left the torn contract on the counter. They took their cold coffee. They walked through the quiet house to the east wing, to the room with the tall south-facing windows and the wide old floors, and she opened the door, and the morning light fell into it, exactly the way it always did at this hour. She walked into the room. He followed. The light was on both of them. She stood in it, and it was warm even in September. The sun coming through glass that had been there for a century, warming the old wood floor, filling the room with the specific quality of morning that she had known, from the first time she stood in the doorway, was exactly what she needed. She reached for his hand. He gave it. Outside, the thrush flew from the oak tree to the garden wall, and from the garden wall to the lavender, and then back up to the tree, going about its morning, with the complete conviction of a creature that has found its place and does not question it. She thought, I know that feeling now. She thought, I know exactly what that feels like. And she did. In the weeks after the morning room, after the torn contract on the counter, after the arms around her in the kitchen, and the cold coffee, and the September garden moving gently outside, Elena did the practical things. She called Kate, who had been storing her belongings for 9 months, with the patient good humor of a cousin who understood, without being told, that something significant was happening, and that she should ask questions only when she was invited to. Elena told her. She told her carefully and completely, the way she did everything, and Kate listened, and when Elena was finished, Kate said, with the specific warmth of someone who loves you, and has been worried about you, good. She called Carol, the paralegal, because Carol deserved to know. Carol asked 3 very precise questions about the legal implications of the changed situation, found the answers satisfactory, and then said, with a professional composure that did not quite conceal her genuine pleasure, that is very good news, Elena. Elena agreed with her. She called the clinic coordinator and had the conversation about a longer-term arrangement, which the coordinator received with undisguised relief, because Elena was good at what she did, and the clinic needed people who were good at what they did, and the temporary absence had been workable but not ideal. She went back to the city with Dominic one afternoon to collect her belongings from Kate's, and Kate and Dominic met for the first time in Kate's small and slightly chaotic flat, and Kate made tea with the slightly excessive care of someone who is trying very hard not to visibly assess a person, and Dominic accepted the tea and complimented the view, which was a generous description of what was visible from Kate's window, and Kate liked him immediately, and told Elena so in 3 separate messages over the following week. The belongings came back to the estate in a small van, and were distributed, largely, to the morning room. The books, of which there were many, went into boxes marked shelves, because the walnut shelves were still 6 weeks from being installed. The other things, the particular lamp she could not sleep without, the collection of pressed leaves her father had started and she had continued, the miscellaneous small objects of a life, found their places in the morning room, and the sitting room and the bedroom, and the rooms absorbed them without effort, which was how rooms feel when they are the right rooms. She also had a longer conversation with her mother, who came to the estate for a weekend in October, which was the first time Margaret Hartley had seen where her daughter had been living for the past 10 months, and the first time she met Dominic, and the first time she sat in the garden on a Saturday afternoon with a cup of tea, and looked at the lavender on the east path and said, quietly and with the complete satisfaction of someone who had been hoping for exactly this, that she was glad. Dominic had shown Margaret around the garden on the first afternoon, which Elena had not arranged but had also not been surprised by. He had answered her mother's questions about the oak tree and the rose beds and the specific variety of lavender they had planted in July, and Elena had watched from the kitchen doorway with Della beside her, and Della had said, without taking her eyes off the scene in the garden, that he was very good with her. "I know," Elena said. "He is not usually very good with people he has just met," Della said. "He is too much in his own head." "He is trying," Elena said. "Yes," Della said. "That is exactly it." They watched Margaret ask Dominic something about the east wall, and Dominic answering with what appeared to be considerable detail, and Margaret nodding with the specific nod of someone who is pleased with an answer, and Elena thought, "My mother and the man I love are talking about a garden wall, and the world is entirely and specifically fine." On the Sunday morning, before Margaret left, Elena found her sitting in the morning room with a cup of tea. In the chair Elena had not yet moved into the room, because the shelves were not yet in, and the room was still largely unfurnished. Her mother was sitting in the chair that had been carried in from the sitting room as a placeholder, and she was looking at the light coming through the southeast windows, and she looked, Elena thought, exactly like herself, sharp and warm and entirely present. "This is a good room," Margaret said when Elena came in. "I know," Elena said. "The light is right for a reading room. That is what it is going to be." Margaret looked at her daughter. She looked at her the way she had always looked at her, completely, carefully, in the way of someone who has been reading this particular person for 26 years and has gotten very good at it. "You look like yourself," she said. Elena sat down on the floor by the window, because that was where Dominic had sat a few mornings ago, and she had thought then that it was a good place to sit. "I feel like myself," she said. Her mother nodded. She looked at the light. "He cleared this room out in February," Elena said. A pause. "I know," Margaret said. "He told me." Elena looked at her. "He told you?" "Yesterday afternoon, in the garden. He was explaining the east path, and he mentioned that he had cleared out the room in winter, because he thought you might want it. I asked him why February specifically, and he said—" Margaret paused, with the precision of someone who had remembered something exactly. "He said that by February he had understood that there was a difference between a useful arrangement and a person. He seemed to think that was obvious." Elena sat with that for a moment. "He said the same thing to me," she said. "Yes," her mother said. "He seems to be a man who says what he means and means what he says." "He is," Elena said. Margaret finished her tea. "Good," she said, and stood up, and went to pack her bag, and Elena sat in the morning light, on the floor of the morning room, and thought about a man who had cleared out a room in February, before he knew if she would stay. She thought, "I am going to spend a very long time being glad that I did." She thought, "That is a very good thing to know." Outside, the oak tree was in the particular state it was in every October, turning, slowly, from green to gold, the leaves going one at a time, the process so gradual you could never catch the exact moment of any single change, only the accumulated difference over days. The thrush was in it somewhere, occupied and settled. She sat in the light. She was home.